Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, by Ronald McNair Scott. Preface. The life of Robert Bruce coincides with the wars of Scottish independence, when a small kingdom struggled for its existence against an overbearing neighbour. In this struggle, Bruce played an increasingly prominent part and eventually became the deliverer of his country. His name, therefore, appears constantly in the state papers of the time and the 13th and 14th century chronicles. The fascination for the historian is that, in addition to these sources, there is another so full of vivid descriptions of the events and characters of the period that a bare recital of facts can be transmitted into a biography of great human interest. In 1375, less than 50 years after Bruce's death, John Barbour, Archdeacon of Aberdeen, produced his epic life of Robert Bruce, the Bruce. In his opening canto, he declares his intention to tell nothing but the truth, to put in writ a soothfast story. Wherever it has been possible to check his account against contemporary documents, scholars have confirmed his reliability. Occasionally the order of events is transposed, but the accuracy of his detail has been accepted by every subsequent historian. Barbour was born some 7 years before Bruce died, over the years preceding the completion of his work, when he was gaining position in the church and at the Scottish court. He had the opportunity to meet many of those who had taken part with Bruce in the extraordinary adventures which seemed to belong to the realm of fiction rather than of fact. No doubt, when old men tell their tales, they sometimes heighten and embellish the dramatic incidents of their past, but the essential truth is there. The liveliness of Barbour's descriptions bears the stamp of eyewitness accounts. The reader is justified in a willing suspension of disbelief. The encouragement and criticism I have received in the writing of this book from my family, friends, and correspondents have been invaluable. In particular, I would like to thank, first, General Sir Philip Christison, Baronet, G.B.E., C.B., D.S.O., M.C., D.L., who put at my disposal the research notes he accumulated over the decade before he wrote his account of the Battle of Bannockburn for the Scottish National Trust. Second, Major General the Earl of Cathcart, D.S.O., M.C., who made available to me the manuscript history of his family, written by his grandfather, his ancestor, Sir Alan Cathcart, was among the young men who joined Bruce in his bid for the throne, and is the only person who John Barbour mentions by name as one of his informants. Lastly, no writer on the period can fail to mention his debt to Professor G.W.S. Barrow's monumental work on Robert Bruce and the community of the realm. Part 1. 1285 to 1306. Our nation lived in freedom and quietness until Edward, King of England, under color of friendship and alliance, attacked us, all unsuspecting, when we had neither king nor head, and our people were unacquainted with wars and invasions. Scottish Declaration of Arbroath, 1320. Chapter 1. On the 14th of October 1285, Alexander III, King of Scotland, married as his second wife Yolande of Dreux, descended from Count Robert I of Dreux, a son of Louis VI of France. It was a marriage welcomed by his subjects. His first wife, Margaret, daughter of Henry III of England, had died in 1275, having borne for her husband a daughter and 2 sons, Margaret, Alexander, and David. But within the space of 3 years all were dead, the younger son in 1281 unmarried, the elder in 1284, without issue, and in 1283 the daughter, who was married to Eric II, King of Norway, died in childbirth, leaving as heir to the Scottish and Norwegian thrones a sickly infant, Margaret, the Maid of Norway. The succession stood in jeopardy. Alexander III was of a sanguine temperament, and during his 10 years as a widower, as the Lanarkrost Chronicle sourly reports, he used never to forbear on account of season or storm, not for perils of flood or rocky cliffs, but would visit none, too creditably matrons and nuns, virgins and widows by day or by night, as the fancy seized him, sometimes in disguise, often accompanied by a single follower. His marriage to the young French woman, it might be expected, would concentrate his attentions and give promise of a male heir to the throne. For over 200 years, since Birnam Wood came to Dunsinane, and the forces of Malcolm III had defeated and slain Macbeth, the House of Canmore had been the rulers of Scotland. During the reigns of 8 succeeding kings of that blood, by conquest or by treaty, the realm had been enlarged so that when Alexander wed Yolande, she became the queen of a kingdom which differed little in extent from the Scotland of the present day. But the population was much smaller. The inhabitants were numbered fewer than 500,000. The majority were Celts, mainly north of the Forth and Clyde and in the southwest. There were Norsemen in Caithness, Sutherland, and the Western Isles, Anglo-Saxons in Lothian, and along the east coast in ports that sound like a drum roll, Inverness, Elgin, Aberdeen, Perth, Montrose, Dundee, Edinburgh, Berwick, were colonies of foreign merchants, Germans from the Hanseatic towns, Scandinavians from the Kingdom of Norway, Frenchmen from Gascony, and, more numerous than the rest, Flemings from the Low Countries. Aberdeen was virtually a Flemish enclave, and in Berwick they had their own headquarters, the Red Hall, held directly from the crown on condition that they would always defend it against the King of England. The country, too, was infinitely wilder. Vast forests of the native Scottish pine abounded, dark and impenetrable, in which wolves and the wild boar still roamed in wide wastes of moor and bog. Mountain and water covered much of the land. Apart from the King's highway, the Via Regis, few roads were capable of carrying wheel traffic except in a dry summer. Transport was mostly by pack horse along tracks which might become impassable in winter. Bridges were few and far between. Within little more than a decade the great forests and deep ravines, the mist-hung hillsides and rugged tracks were to become the salvation and refuge of desperate men. But in the year of Alexander III's wedding, Scotland was still at peace, a prosperous and settled kingdom. For nearly 100 years, her English neighbors, torn by internal feuds and incontinental wars, had little leisure to turn a predatory eye northwards, and Norway, having launched a formidable armada against the west coast in 1263, had seen her ships tossed and scattered by a violent storm, and the stragglers who led in Argyllshire easily defeated at the Battle of Largs. In 1266, by the Treaty of Perth, the Norwegians ceded the Isle of Man and the Western Isles, except the Orkneys and Shetlands, to Scotland in return for a monetary tribute, and a growing collaboration between the two countries was cemented by the marriage of Alexander's daughter to the Norwegian king. Thus, for the 36 years that he had reigned, Alexander III and his people had enjoyed a period of tranquility, unparalleled by any other Western kingdom at that time. In this fostering climate of peace, agriculture and trade made steady progress, under the lead of the Scottish Church, which had been strengthened and enlarged by many royal grants of land. Improvements had been made in the art of tillage and the management of livestock. Now clearings and new grazings had been brought into production by the joint efforts of landlord, thane, and peasant. An expanding export trade in wool, hides, timber, and fish with England, the Low Countries, the Hanseatic towns, and Scandinavia had brought an increased flow of riches to the merchants and landowners, which percolated throughout the whole society. The eastern ports hummed with activity. Berwick, at one extremity, was described by a contemporary English writer as a city so populous and of such trade that it might justly be called another Alexandria, whose riches were the sea and the water its walls. At the other extremity, Inverness was a shipyard for mighty vessels. But affluence without a security is a cause more for anxiety than for comfort. It is because the turbulent elements among the Scottish people had, by the reign of Alexander III, been brought under control by the network of a feudal organization, that trade flourished. The traveler could ride unharmed, the peasant could reap his crops, and the craftsmen and purveyors clustered in the royal burghs could pursue their avocations without one hand upon their swords. The feudal system was based on the concept that all land belonged to the king, and that he had leased large provinces to his leading noblemen as tenants-in-chief in return for their oath of fealty, and their pledge to bring to his aid, in time of war, a stipulated number of armed knights, in like manner, in a descending gradation of subtenure. These vassals of the crown divided the land which the king had granted to them into smaller estates, which they leased to knights and gentlemen in return for their service in war and attendance in peace. They, in turn, leased their land to lesser men, who cultivated it with or without husbandmen and serfs, and would present themselves to their masters as the call to arms, with shield and spear. It had a profound economic base. War, in the Middle Ages, was the central factor of political life, and the dominating element in war was the mailed warrior mounted on his horse. The ruler who aspired to enlarge or protect his possessions required a force of armed cavalry, a force which by its combination of shock and mobility was as irresistible against men fighting on foot as tanks against savages. To mount and arm such a warrior required a long purse. Horses bred for carrying and staying power, suits of chain-link mail beaten out by the armorer for individual fitting, helmets, shields, lances, swords, battle-axes and maces, squires for arming, grooms for the horses, all these were costly. To manage the horses, to wield the weapons required continuous training. The knight was a fighting specialist. He had no time to earn his livings, so he was allotted land for his service from which he could draw rents in money or in kind to defray his expenses. He was both the mailed fist of the king and the shield of his subjects. The system originated among the Franks. It was perfected in England under William the Conqueror and his sons, and was introduced into the Celtic kingdom of Scotland by David I on his assuming the throne in 1124. David had been brought up in the English court, where his sister was married to Henry I of England. He had been greatly favored by his royal brother-in-law. In Scotland, with English support, he had established himself in Lothian and Strathclyde as a virtually independent ruler within the kingdom of his brother, King Alexander I. In England, by marriage and kingly sanction, he had acquired the huge Honour of Huntingdon, with broad lands spreading across the counties of Huntingdon and Northamptonshire. There, among his tenants-in-chief, were a clutch of Anglo-Normans deriving from the same region on the borders of Normandy and Brittany. The Morvilles, the Solisys, the Fitzalans, the Bruces. When David I took over the governance of an unruly kingdom, it was to these he looked to set up military fiefs in sensitive areas, each with its castle and Norman lord. Other Anglo-Normans followed in their train: Comyans and Balliolls, Sinclairs and Frasers, Mowbrays and Hays, and were granted charter for land in Scotland. Contemporaneously, the great Celtic landowners, who had hitherto held their land by tribal custom, and their possessions and privileges confirmed by charters from the crown. On the whole, this proceeded smoothly, there was no dispossession of existing landowners. The lands granted were from estates, which had been forfeited to the crown, or where native families had died out, or from the royal demesnes. Gradually the kingdom became dotted with castles, some great stone edifices built on upthrusts of rock such as Edinburgh or Stirling, some on precipitous sea cliffs such as Turnberry or Dunaverty, but the majority were simple moats, huge earthen mounds surrounded by wooden stockades, and deep ditches with a central tower skirted by the wooden living quarters, each forming a sentinel for the security of the area, and a focus for the local community. Such central government as existed was provided by the king and the officers of his household, the constable, the king's chief military officer, flanked by the mareschal, in special charge of the cavalry element, the chamberlain, who provided for the cost of administration from the royal rents, feudal dues, and other imposts, the chancellor, the keeper of the royal seal, and crown records, who, besides presiding over the king's chapel, was virtually a secretary of state for all departments. He was invariably a cleric, and was assisted by numerous chaplains and clerks to undertake the necessary written documents for the ordering of the kingdom. The fourth great officer was the steward responsible for the management of the royal household. David I had granted this office to Walter Fitzalan in 1136. William I, David's grandson, made it hereditary in the family. Thereafter, the Fitzalans were known as Stuarts, the ancestors of the royal house of that name. Outside the household were the chief administrative and judicial officers of the crown, the Justicara of Galloway. Below them were the sheriffs, some 30 in all, who acted as royal agents in the local districts into which the kingdom was divided. They were the sinews of the administration, presiding over courts for free men to use, collecting and accounting for royal revenues, supervising the royal castles in their sheriffdoms. All these were appointed by the king and were usually drawn from the earls and barons who were already prominent landowners in their areas. By the closing years of Alexander III's reign, intermarriage between the Anglo-Norman and Celtic magnates was far advanced. Already a third of the ancient Celtic earldoms were held by men of Anglo-Norman descent, and although many of the leading men held estates in both English and Scottish kingdoms, the cordial relations between Alexander III and his brother-in-law, Edward I, posed no threat of divided loyalties. The administration had never been more stable, the country more prosperous, the throne more secure. Not for another 500 years were such conditions again to obtain, and it is no surprise that succeeding generations were to look back on Alexander III's reign as a golden age, hauntingly evoked in the words of the first of Scotland's poets, Andrew Winton. Quahen Alexandri our king was the day that Scotland led in lure and lay. Away ye was sons of ale and bread, of wine and wax, of gunyon and glee. Our gold was changed into leady, Christ born into virginity, secure Scotland and remedy. That statter is in perplexite. Into that age Robert Bruce was born into a mind and temper, courage and magnetism, to meet and match the horrors which the future was soon to let loose upon his country. Chapter 2. Robert Bruce was born on the 11th of July, 1274, at Turnberry Castle, of which the remains can still be seen perched on the cliffs which plunge steeply into the waters of the Firth of Clyde. He was the eldest child of a fruitful and happy marriage, which had begun in romantic circumstances. His father, the sixth Robert of that name, at the age of 24 had enrolled in a crusade to the Holy Land under the banner of Prince Edward, soon to become King Edward I of England. Among his knightly companions was Adam de Kilconquhar, great-grandson of Duncan, Earl of Fife. Adam was killed in the Palestine defense of Acre, leaving as widow his young bride, already with child, Marjorie, Countess of Carrick in her own right. Powerful as may have been the forces which called Adam de Kilconquhar to arms, there must have remained in the mind of the Countess a residue of resentment that he had so soon exchanged his marriage bed for the wars, and when the sixth Robert, after his safe return in 1272, called on her with news of her husband's death, it is understandable that in her most vulnerable period of widowhood, she should have welcomed the supporting presence of the young crusader in her house. Legend has it that her attendants were instructed by one means or another to delay his departure, with the happy result that she shortly became his wife, and over the years bore him a large family of 5 sons and 5 daughters. It was a marriage that, from the worldly point of view, had everything to commend it. The Countess Majori was the last of her line. Her father, Neil, Earl of Carrick, was the only direct descendant of Fergus, Lord of Galloway, a Celtic prince who, in the reign of King David I, exercised an almost independent power over the southwest of Scotland. In 1256, when Majori was still a baby, her father died, leaving her sole possessor of the great Celtic kingdom of Carrick. Her new husband, who, on his marriage, became by right of his wife, Earl of Carrick, was already the heir to the vast estates of his father, Robert the Competitor, whose principal Scottish possession of Annandale marched with Carrick. The Bruces were members of that Anglo-Norman elite through whom the kings of England and Scotland maintained their sovereign rule, reputedly descended from Lodver, the Norse Earl of Orkney, in the 10th century. The Bruces first made their impact on the British Isles when Adam de Bruce, whose grandfather had migrated to Normandy, accompanied William the Conqueror to England. He was given the task of reducing Anglo-Saxon resistance in Yorkshire, and as a reward for his services, was granted numerous manors in and around that county. His eldest son, the first Robert, became one of the great magnates of northern England, Lord of Cleveland, and a royal justice for Henry I. In 1124, his possessions were notably increased. In that year, King David I, who was his feudal overlord in England, succeeded to the Scottish throne, and one of his first acts was to grant to his most important tenant-in-chief. The lordship of Annandale was a key to one of the gateways of Scotland. From that date, the Bruces became the virtual wardens of the western marches. The first Robert combined the shrewdness of a Norman and a Yorkshire man. Having advised King David I in vain against a Scottish invasion of England in 1138, he resolved the problem of his dual loyalty by divesting himself, in the thick of a time, of his Scottish possessions in favor of his younger son, the second Robert, and fought stoutly on behalf of his English sovereign at the Battle of the Standard. The second Robert, for his part, though only 14, donned his armor and ranged himself in the ranks of the Scottish king. Tradition has it that father and son met on the eve of the battle, and in a moving scene, each tried to persuade the other to refrain from risking his life on the following day, but without avail. Fortunately, neither suffered injury in the fray. The second Robert lived to a ripe old age. He had 2 sons, the third Robert of that name and William, who both predeceased him, so that on his death in 1196, his inheritance passed to William's eldest son, the 4th Robert. There is a certain monotony in the Bruce's choice of Christian names. In 1209, the 4th Robert married Isabel, younger daughter of David, Earl of Huntingdon, the youngest of King David I's 3 grandsons, of whom the 2 elder, Malcolm IV and William I, had succeeded him in turn on the Scottish throne. This marriage was to have a profound effect on the future of the Bruces. Isabel held large estates in her own right both in England and Scotland, and when the 4th Robert died in 1245 and Isabel in 1252, the 5th Robert, the competitor, received lands in both countries of such extent as to make him one of the most influential men in either Scotland or England. In 1238, a dazzling prospect opened before him. Queen Joanne, the wife of Alexander II, died childless, and there was no apparent heir. To safeguard the succession, the king called his magnates together, and in their presence and with their consent, designated the fifth Robert as his heir presumptive. But the period of anticipation was brief. In May 1239, Alexander married again and sired on this second wife, Mary de Courcy, a son who was born in September 1241, the future Alexander III. Nevertheless, the fact that the kingdom of Scotland had once been within his grasp was deeply engraved on Robert's mind, and when, nearly 50 years later, the opportunity seemed once more to arise, the old man roused himself from his retirement to make a masterful bid for the throne. Meanwhile, in May 1240, Robert the Competitor had married Isabel de Clare, daughter of the Earl of Gloucester and niece of the Earl Marshal of England, linked as he thus became to the innermost circles of the English ruling families. He devoted many of his abilities to the service of Henry III of England, fighting for him against Simon de Montfort on the disastrous field of Lewes, acting as a trusted intermediary between the English and Scottish thrones, and carrying out his duties as Sheriff of Cumberland and Governor of Carlisle. The Leonard-Cost Chronicle writes, "He was of handsome appearance, a gifted speaker, remarkable for his influence and, what is most important, most devoted to God and the clergy. It was his custom to entertain and feast more liberally than all other courtiers, and was most hospitable to all his guests, nor used the pilgrim to remain outside his gates, for his door was open to the wayfarer. His devotion to God and his indomitable character were made equally evident when in 1270 he resigned all his offices at the age of 60, accompanied by his son the sixth Robert, embarked on the long voyage to the Middle East to face the rigors of a crusader's life in the Holy Land. When he had returned in 1272, his old friend and master, Henry III, had died, and a new vigorous monarch, Edward I, was on the English throne. It was time for him to settle quietly on the family estates and enjoy the pleasures of his second marriage to a neighboring widow, Christiana of Araby, which took place in May 1273, and to anticipate with confidence the benediction of the formidable Saint Malachy. The curse of Saint Malachy had exercised his mind ever since he came to manhood. More than 100 years earlier, in 1148, Saint Malachy, Archbishop of Armagh, on his way to Rome from Ireland, had spent the night at the house of the second Robert in the town of Annan. Hearing that a thief had been captured shortly before and was awaiting sentence, he asked, as a boon from his host, that the man's life should be spared. His request was granted, and he blessed the household, but as he set out on his journey, the next morning he saw the thief hanging from the gallows. Outraged by the duplicity of his host, he revoked his blessing and laid a perpetual curse on the family of the Bruces. When Robert the Competitor became heir presumptive to Alexander II, it was clear to him that steps must be taken to remove what appeared to many of the superstitious a grievous disability. He journeyed to the saint's tomb, and on his knees beside it prayed that the curse might be lifted. He repeated these visits on many occasions. Finally, in 1272, on his way back from the Holy Land, he confirmed by a charter, still preserved at Clairvaux, a perpetual rent to God and the Blessed Mary and to the house and monks of Clairvaux, in order to maintain of lights before the blessed Malachy, and for the good of his own soul and the souls of his predecessors and successors. He could well feel that a benediction was now his due. Lochmaben Castle, at the head of the Annandale Valley, in which he dwelt with his new wife, was a powerful stone-built fortress, sited on a promontory jutting into the waters of the loch, the embracing arms of which were joined by a canal, surrounded on all sides by water. It was some 60 miles from his son the Earl of Carrick's castle at Turnberry. A long day's ride, but close enough to assume that according to the ordinary pattern of family relationship, there would have been constant visits between the two households, and that he would have attended the christening of his first grandson, Robert Bruce. Of Robert Bruce, there is no written record from the time of his birth certificate in July 1274 until July 1286, when in the Paisley Registrum his signature is appended as witness to a deed of Alexander MacDonald of Islay, in company with his father the Earl of Carrick, the Bishop of Argyll, the Vicar of Arran, and the Clerk of Kintyre, as well as other personages. During these 12 years, he would have spent much of his time with his foster brothers and sisters, children of the women to whom, as was then customary, he would have been handed over at birth to be suckled. Again, from 1286 to 1292, there is no record, but as the child is father of the man, so from the known history of the man can be deduced the upbringing of the child. The Robert Bruce who, when he was a hunted man, beguiled his haggard followers on the hillside by reading to them a French romance, must have had book learning in his youth. He would have spoken the Norman French of his peers, and in the Celtic household of his parents absorbed from their retainers the Gaelic language, which was dominant from Galloway in the southwest up through the western highlands to the mountains of Inverness. In his grandfather's house, too, he would have heard spoken and learnt the northern English, which was to become the broad Scots of later generations, and was then the common speech from the borders to Strathclyde and from Lothian to the trading ports on the eastern seaboard. He would have become trilingual at an early age, an accomplishment most necessary for one who was to draw supporters for his struggle from all three spheres. And since in his prime Robert Bruce was ranked with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry and Sir Giles d'Argentan as one of the three most accomplished knights in Christendom, it is certain that as soon as he was able, he was trained in the handling of arms and the management of horses. The society in which he lived was a military one, and martial prowess was sought with an obsessive passion. When knights could not exercise their skill on the field of battle, they took part in tournaments, which were immensely popular all over Europe. These combined the stimulus of risk and the possibility of profit. The defeated knight forfeited his horse and arms, or had to pay a ransom to reclaim them. So rich were these prizes that often knights made up teams to share the gains or dilute the losses, or wealthy backers would club together to equip a promising but indignant competitor and participate in his spoils. The reputations of consistent champions were internationally known, and those in the top rank, such as Robert Bruce became, carried with them an aura of success, which had a psychological effect in the clash of war. In the love-hate syndrome, which can be detected in Edward I's relationship to Robert Bruce, the chivalric fame of the latter may well have played its part, but their meeting was still in the future. Meanwhile, the towering figure of Edward I, 7 feet from mailed feet to crested helmet, was to cast a long shadow on Scotland. Chapter 3. The year 1286 was ushered into Scotland by storms so thunderous and recurrent that many a wiseacre shook his head, and doleful men predicted the imminence of a calamity. A strengthening rumor rippled through the countryside that 18th of March was to be the day of judgment. On that very day, Alexander III called together at Edinburgh Castle the lords of his council in conference, and after the meeting, entertained them at dinner. The feast was long. The Lanarkos Chronicle relates the cups were filled, the king was in tearing spirits, chaffing his companions about the prophecies of doom, passing to one of his barons a dish of lampreys, bidding him to eat and make merry, for he should know that this was Judgment Day, to which the baron replied, "If this be Judgment Day, we shall arise with full bellies." As the red wine of Gascony mounted in his veins, the vision of Yolande, the young bride he had left in the royal manor of Kinghorn, 20 miles away, became more and more alluring. In spite of the tempestuous weather outside and the remonstrances of his nobles, he called for his horse and, followed by 3 squires, made haste along the road to the ferry at Dalmeny. When he reached the village, the ferry master urged on him the hazards of the crossing, and begged him to return to Edinburgh. "Are you afraid to die with me?" asked the king. "By no means," replied the ferry master. "I could not die better than in the company of your father's son," and forthwith rowed them across the 2 miles of turbulent water to the burgh of Inverkeithing. Landing in profound darkness, they were met by Alexander, the royal purveyor, who, recognizing the king's voice, called out, "My lord, what are you doing here in such storm and darkness? How often have I not tried to persuade you that these midnight rambles will do you no good? Stay with us, and we'll provide you with all that you want until the morning light." But the king, still impelled by the dual urge of royal duty and private pleasure, asked only for 2 countrymen to guide him, and set off with his escort along the coast road to Kinghorn. In the howling wind and darkness, the little party soon lost all contact with each other, and next morning the king was found dead on the seashore below the cliffs, his neck broken. A great grief fell upon the kingdom, and apprehension for the future. The heir apparent was a small girl in a foreign land, and although at Scone in 1284, in the presence of Alexander III, the magnates of the realm had promised, failing his direct issue, to recognize his granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, as their liege lady and sovereign queen. Many who had so promised under the eye of their king, when the possibility seemed remote, now that the king was dead, began to have reservations. No woman had ever before become the ruler of Scotland. Some harked back to the old Celtic Tanist tradition, under which when a king died, the nearest male relative took over the reins of power. Others began to edge closer to one or other of the 2 powerful families, the Comyns and the Bruces, who numbered among their member males of the royal blood. Like 2 stiff-legged dogs circling with hackles raised, the 2 families eyed each other, ready to launch into action if any move was made by their rival. The whiff of civil war was in the air. But Alexander III had left behind him a firm infrastructure of government. The chancellery, the civil service of the time, was largely manned by clerics. The church had her fingers on the pulse of administration, and the church was the one single coherent institution which covered the whole country. Next to the crown, she was the largest landowner in the kingdom. Her many tenants, lairds, thanes, and smallholders were men of the native race, rooted deep in the soil, a solid substratum of Scottish men, beneath the shifting oligarchy of Normans, whose lands and loyalties were split between Scotland and England, with undeviating purpose, but often by devious means. She was determined to preserve the independence of Scotland and the Scottish Church. As soon as the royal funeral had taken place on the 29th of March 1286, Bishops Wishart of Glasgow and Fraser of St. Andrews dispatched 2 Dominican friars to Edward I, brother-in-law of the late king, and Horatio, a good friend to their country, to inform him of the event. A month later, when Queen Yolande's claims to be pregnant proved illusory, they summoned to Scone the bishops, abbots, and priors, the earls and barons and good men of the country, to pledge their fealty to the young queen over the water, Margaret of Norway, the last survivor of the house of Canmore, and to swear, on pain of excommunication by the bishops, to protect and uphold the peace of her land. To this end, a regency was appointed to represent the community of the realm, Communitas Regni Scotti, the whole body of the free subjects of the crown. The regency consisted of 6 guardians, of whom 2 were earls, those of Bohun and Fife. 2 were churchmen, the bishops of St. Andrews and Glasgow. 2 were barons, James Stewart and John Comyn. Of these, the first named 3 were responsible for Scotland, north of the Forth, and the other 3 for the south. Deliberately, neither Robert the Competitor nor John Baliol of Galloway, both of whom had pretensions to the throne, was elected, but of the guardians the Earl of Bohun, the Bishop of St. Andrews, and John Comyn were there to safeguard the interest of John Baliol, whose sister was married to John Comyn. The others were supporters of Robert Bruce. It was in all a carefully thought-out constitutional compromise, and, as a neighborly gesture and diplomatic courtesy, 3 envoys, the Bishop of Brecon, the Abbot of Jedburgh, and Sir Geoffrey de Mowbray, were commissioned by the Scone Parliament to seek out Edward I in Gascony and acquaint him with the arrangement. In the meantime, a seal was struck for the guardians, without which no ordinance in the future would be accounted valid. Edward I received the envoy early in September 1286 at the town of Saints. He was then actively engaged in arriving at an agreement with the King of France over various disputed territories in Normandy, Limousin, and other areas, defining the boundaries of Gascony and reforming its government, enterprises which were to occupy his attention until his return to England in August 1289. He dismissed the envoys courteously, with expressions of goodwill to the guardians, and the promise, at their request, to shelve a border dispute which was causing friction between the 2 countries. But he kept his own counsel about the future he had already envisaged for Scotland. Edward I was one of the most able and ably advised of all the monarchs of England. The foundations of English literature and Parliament were laid in his reign. The pretensions of the Church were reduced and contained. The system of feudal levies was adapted and transformed to provide a fighting force of immense flexibility and power. He was a man of commanding presence, tall, handsome, and spare. On the field of battle he was fearless, in his private life chaste. He was sober in his mode of living, dressed simply, and was constant in his religious devotions. But the overriding element in his character was his unquestioning belief that whatever he desired was right and in the interest of all concerned. A contemporary wrote, "He is valiant as a lion, quick to attack the strongest, and fearing the onslaught of none. But if a lion in pride and fierceness, he is panther in fickleness and inconstancy, changing his word and promise, cloaking himself by pleasant speech. When he is concerned, he promises whatever you wish, but as soon as he has escaped, he forgets his promise. The treachery or falsehood by which he has advanced, he calls prudence, and the path by which he attains his ends, however crooked, he calls straight, and whatever he likes, he says is lawful." When the news had come of his brother-in-law's death, he pondered deeply on the consequences. Hitherto, if he was involved in continual warfare, he had known that he had a friendly ruler at his back. Now no such certainty obtained. The French already had links with Scotland through Alexander's widow, Yolande de Dreux, and could strengthen them to their advantage. Above all, the Maid of Norway, with the Scottish kingdom as her dowry, would soon excite the interest of royal suitors from the courts of Europe. It was essential that he had as much control of Scotland as he had of Wales. His first move was to make sure that there should be no consort for the young Queen of Scotland, other than his youngest and only surviving son, Edward of Carnarvon, who had been born in 1284. For that end, he had already prepared the way. On the 29th of March 1286, within a few days of Alexander's death, he had put the Maid of Norway's father, King Eric, in his debt by making him a personal loan of £2,000 sterling, and had resolved the problem of his own son's marriage being within the forbidden degrees of the Church by obtaining from the Pope, in May of that year, a bull dispensing with the impediments of affinity and legitimizing any issue that might result. The groundwork had been laid, but young Edward was barely 2 years old, and the time was not yet ripe for the next move forward, the return of the Scottish envoys to their country, bringing with them the approbation of Edward I, was a welcome support to the guardians in a critical situation. During the envoy's absence, trouble had flared in the southwest of Scotland. Robert the Competitor and his son the Earl of Carrick, gathering the retainers together, had seized the two royal castles of Dumfries and Wigton, and the Belial stronghold of Boutelli, and on the 20th of September 1286 had entered into a sworn agreement with James Stewart, one of the Guardians, Angus MacDonald, Lord of the Isles, the Earls of March and Menteith, and other noblemen to band themselves together. Robert the Competitor had been stirred from his retirement by two strong motives. First, to secure his base by hemming in the Galloway domain of his rival John Belial, and so keeping open to Nithsdale route between Annandale and Carrick. Second, by seizing the castles and signing the Turnberry bond to indicate to King Edward, his old companion in arms and fellow crusader, that at a nod from his royal head, the Bruces had the potential to take over the government of Scotland. But no sooner was it known that the Guardians had received the backing of Edward I than the raised fists were folded in peace. Robert the Competitor was too shrewd a magnate to pursue his purpose without the support of tacit approval of the English monarch. A calm descended upon the country, and for 4 years the Guardians, backed by a permanent council of magnates, were able to carry out their administration without further incident. In 1289, their number was reduced to 4. The Earl of Buchan died from old age, and the Earl of Fife, described by the Lanercost Chronicle as cruel and greedy beyond average, was murdered by his kinsmen. It was fortunate that among the survivors were the 2 bishops, for these were the professionals, trained in law and diplomacy, and determined to uphold the national identity of Scotland. Their skills were shortly to be needed in the negotiations with Edward I. As soon as Edward I returned to England in the late summer of 1289, he moved cautiously towards his objective, exercising his moral authority as brother-in-law of the dead king and great-uncle of the young queen. He invited the King of Norway and the Scottish Regency to send commissioners to confer on her future. The King of Norway sent ambassadors. Edward himself appointed the Earl of Pembroke, the Bishop of Winchester, the Earl of Surrey, and Anthony Beck, the militant Bishop of Durham, to act on his behalf, and the Scottish Regency empowered 3 of the Guardians, John Comyn of Badenoch, and the 2 bishops, together with Robert the Competitor, to treat with due care in all possible contingencies for the honor and liberty of the Scottish realm. The plenipotentiaries met at Salisbury in October, and by the 6th of November had reached an amicable agreement that the Queen should be sent to Scotland or England by the 1st of November 1290, but without prejudice to the question of her marriage, that if it was in England she should be delivered to Scotland, provided it was in a safe and peaceful condition, and that the Scots should refrain from engaging her in any marriage contract without the consent of her father and great-uncle. Encouraged by the smooth passage of these negotiations, Edward I, within a few weeks of the Treaty of Salisbury being signed, brought at last into the open the project on which he had been quietly working over the past 3 years. He produced a bull from Pope Nicholas IV, granting dispensation for the marriage of Margaret, now 6 years of age, to his 5-year-old son. This proposal for the union of the crowns was received in Scotland with wary approval. For 100 years there had been peace between the 2 countries, and, with that peace, prosperity. The marriage of Margaret and young Edward would give assurance of that peace continuing. The authority of the Queen would be enhanced by her relationship to a powerful monarch, and the pretensions of ambitious vassals would be abated. On the 17th of March 1290, therefore, letters were sent to the kings of England and Norway in the names of the 4 guardians, 10 bishops, 10 earls, 23 abbots, 11 priors, and 48 barons, speaking for the whole community of Scotland, agreeing to the marriage in principle. But the churchmen of the Chancellery were not unaware that the See of York nursed claims for supremacy over the Scottish bishoprics and the Scottish magnates, who had done homage for their English lands to Edward-I, in person knew well the imperious temper of that monarch, and his consolidating ambitions. Even King Eric of Norway had his reservations, and when a Yarmouth ship, specially equipped by Edward-I, with sweetmeats, fruit, and gingerbread for the comfort of Maid Margaret, arrived in May 1290 at Bergen to carry her back to England, he dismissed it empty-handed. So the Scottish commissioners conducted their negotiations with all the caution of a reluctant virgin in the presence of an ardent suitor, and when the Treaty of Berkham was signed on the 18th of July 1290, in the village of that name, there had been written in specific conditions for the protection of Scotland's independence, as strong as any parchment could create. The laws, liberties, and customs of Scotland were to be observed at all times. The great offices of state were to be held only by Scotsmen. No writ of common law or letter of special favour could be issued except by the King's Chapel, the Royal Chancellery. No taxation of the Scots should be levied except for the needs of the Scottish kingdom. No vassal of the Scottish crown was to do homage for his Scottish lands outside the kingdom. No church matters were to be subject to interference outside the kingdom. No Scottish subject was to be answerable at law outside the kingdom. No parliament dealing with Scottish affairs was to be held outside the kingdom. The whole emphasis was on the separateness of the Scottish kingdom from that of England. There was to be a union of the crowns indeed, but the two countries were to remain as distinct sovereignties, ruled respectively by their native queen and king. Agreement to these terms was endorsed by Edward-I at Northampton on the 28th of August 1290, and many historians have applauded his statesmanship in showing such consideration to the demands of the weaker party. On the surface this would appear to be so, but it is noticeable that after this resounding affirmation that the Scottish kingdom shouldn't be separate, apart, and free in itself without subject to the English kingdom, there is slipped in a clause saving the rights of the King of England, which may justly belong to him. A clause identical to that he inserted in the Forest Charter laws, forced upon him by his barons and on the strength of which he claimed legal justification when he reneged on his undertakings. Even while the commissioners were still discussing the Treaty of Berkham, Edward-I sent Walter Huntercombe with an armed force on the 4th of June 1290 to seize the governorship of the Isle of Man. An integral part of the Scottish realm, of strategic importance, was thus transferred into an English protectorate. In August, he attempted still further pressure by asking the Scottish Regency to allow Anthony Beck, his chief negotiator at the Treaty of Berkham, to be viceroy in Scotland for Queen Margaret and her husband designate, and to accept his ruling in all matters appertaining to the governance and peaceful state of the realm. And yet, pointer to the fact that however accommodating his reaction to the Treaty of Berkham, his settled purpose remained the subservience of the Scottish kingdom to the national interest of England. Nevertheless, for the moment, the Scottish rulers conditioned themselves to see only his Janus face of peace, and throughout September, that best of months in Scotland, a mood of optimism spread through the country at the prospect of the royal marriage. A voyage by sea of the Maid of Norway to the Orkneys was put in hand, and to that outlying possession of the Norwegian crown a deputation from the kingdoms of Scotland and England made their way, while other magnates began to gather at Perth to await her progress south and her inauguration at Scone. But all was for nothing. The little Queen Margaret fell ill on the voyage from Norway to Orkney, and soon after landing there, on the 26th of September 1290. She died in the arms of the Bishop of Bergen. The succession to the throne was now wide open. Chapter 4. No sooner did the news of the Queen's death reach Scotland early in October than Robert the Competitor, although in his 80th year, gathered a strong force of armed men together and hastened to Perth, where the Scottish Council was in session, with the intent to overawe them again any action inadmissible to his interests. The Earls of Mar and Atholl were rumoured to be mustering their forces in his support, and few can doubt that in his train was a young squire of 16 years, already trained in weaponry and well aware of his family's claims, his grandson, Robert Bruce. Down in the south, John Belial, Lord of Galloway, since his mother's death earlier in the year, with the connivance and encouragement of his neighbour and friend Anthony Beck, Prince Bishop of Durham, and right-hand man of Edward-I, declared himself heir to Scotland. A swarm of other claimants dusted their pedigrees and burnished their arms, but none was preponderant enough to gain the crown by force, and all eyes turned towards the English king, whose apparent consideration for the independence of Scotland had so recently been shown, and whose reputation for impartiality had been recognized by the crowns of Europe when he was appointed arbiter between the conflicting claims of Peter of Aragon and Charles of Anjou to the kingdom of Sicily. Bishop Fraser urged him by letter to move to the border in force to prevent bloodshed and press the claims of John Belial. In riposte, the 7 Earls of Angus, Atholl, Lennox, Mar, Menteith, Ross, and Strathern rallied to the side of Bruce and claimed that they alone had the ancient right of instituting a king, and had invited Edward of England to arbitrate. No wolf invited by a flock of sheep to nominate their leading ram could have felt more satisfaction at this juncture than Edward-I. In response to their appeals, he set in train his movement northward, but at Hardby, in Lincolnshire, his beloved consort Eleanor fell ill, and in November 1290 died of fever. All matters of state were immediately put aside, although his marriage to this half-sister of the King of Spain at the age of 15 had been one of dynastic convenience arranged by his father. He had for 35 years devoted himself to her with a fidelity and attachment notable in any class and rare indeed among monarchs. "I loved her dearly during her lifetime," wrote Edward. "I shall not cease to love her now that she is dead." Her body was borne in stately progress to its last resting place in Westminster Abbey, and at every nightfall stopping place a cross was erected in her memory, the last at Charing Cross. Her death wrought an evil change in Edward's nature. The savage streak, inherited from his Angevin ancestors, the devil's breed, which had expressed itself in his youth by acts of wanton cruelty, had been tamed and softened by her gentleness. From now on, without her restraining influence, it was to break out in barbarous reprisals against those who thwarted his purpose. Raw from his bereavement, he delayed no longer to reveal his ambitions, confidently informing his barons in council that he intended to subjugate Scotland as he had Wales. He moved north to Anthony Beck, the Bishop of Durham's castle at Northam on Tweed, and from there invited the representatives of Scotland and the various competitors to meet him on the 30th of May, 1291, with the assurance that their appearance on English soil would not be taken as a precedent. At the same time, he gave orders to his armed forces to join him on the 3rd of June. The Scotsmen, assuming that his action was that of an unbiased arbitrator, duly arrived in his presence. He received them with ostentatious ceremony surrounded by the high officers of his court, and began the proceedings by informing them through his Chief Justice that he had come to resolve the dispute among the claimants to the Scottish throne, not as friend and umpire, but as Lord Paramount, and feudal superior of the Scottish realm. Can you, his address concluded, produce any evidence to show that I am not the rightful suzerain? Taken aback, the Scots asked for time to consider their reply, and were granted 24 hours, and then, after their expostulation, 3 weeks, by which time King Edward knew that he would have his army at his side. If the Scots had chosen to invoke the legalistic formulas by which the king liked to cloak his designs, they would have pointed out that if he genuinely believed he was Lord Paramount, he could already, on the Maid of Norway's accession to the throne, have claimed the right according to feudal law of administrating her heritage while she was still a minor, and the right as her guardian of marrying her to whom he chose. Instead, by signing the Treaty of Bohun, he had accepted that Scotland was an independent kingdom and had guaranteed that it should so continue. They could have reminded him that though by the Treaty of Falaise between Henry II of England and King William I, the Lion of Scotland, King William had agreed in 1174 to accept the overlordship of England in order to be released from captivity, this treaty had been abrogated by Richard I, Coeur de Lion, in 1189, and that when Alexander III, on Edward I's accession to the English throne in 1278, did homage to him for his English lands, he stated categorically, "I become your man for the lands which I hold of you in the kingdom of England, for which I owe you homage, saving my kingdom. To homage for my kingdom of Scotland, no one has any right but God alone, nor do I hold it of any but of God." But guided almost certainly by Bishop Wishart of Glasgow, that continuing champion of Scottish freedom, they went straight to the vital point, that they could not answer for a future king of Scotland. In a memorable letter, in the name of the community of Scotland, delivered to King Edward at the end of May, they wrote, after a courteous preamble, referring to his claim to suzerainty. "Sire, to this the good men who have sent us here say that they know full well that you would not make so great a demand if you did not believe that you had good right to it. Yet of any such right or demand made or used by yourself or your ancestors, they know nothing. They answer with such authority as they possess that they have no power to reply in the absence of a ruler over them, to whom such a demand should be addressed, and who could reply to it. For even if they did reply, it would not increase your right nor take away from the right of their liege lord. But the good men of the kingdom are willing that whoever shall be king shall perform to you whatever right and law require, for he, and no one else, will have the power to do this. Meanwhile, they can only refer to the oath they took after the death of the late king, saving your faith and theirs, and to the treaty confirmed in your presence at Northampton." Brushing aside this petition as containing nothing to the purpose, Edward demanded that as his title was disputed by none, his overlordship should be recognized by all. The Scots were in a helpless situation. Edward lay on their borders with a formidable army at his command. Their country had been so long at peace that it was ungeared for war. The natural military leaders were bitterly divided by the empty throne. They had no alternative but acceptance or annihilation. 9 conferences were held between the 2nd and 13th June, but the upshot was that all the claimants to the crown swore to the king in person, and then publicly repeated their oaths before the assembled lords that they accepted King Edward I as their feudal superior with lawful right to decide their case. And shortly afterward, the guardians of Scotland and the magnates of the realm agreed to hand over to him the custody of their country and its castles in exchange for his solemn promise that within 2 months of his award he would restore them to him who shall gain the right by judgment of royalty, and that on the death of a Scots king he would demand nothing but homage and the rights incidental to it. With Scotland in the hollow of his hand, Edward acted with calculated promptitude. On the 13th of June 1291, on the green at Upsettlington, a little village on the Scottish side of the Tweed opposite Northam Castle, he received the fealty of the guardians and the magnates there present. The 4 guardians resigned into his hands the office which they had received from the community of Scotland, and were reappointed by the most serene prince, by God's grace, illustrious King of England, superior Lord of Scotland, with the addition of a 5th guardian, an English baron, Brian Fitzalan of Bedale. A new chancellor was installed with an Englishman as his colleague. The constables of the Scottish castles resigned their charges, and were reappointed as his sworn liege men. Then, setting out from Upsettlington, he made a ceremonial progress by way of Haddington, Edinburgh, and Linlithgow to Stirling. At Stirling, he issued a proclamation that by the 27th of July, on pain of severe penalties, all men of substance throughout the kingdom should swear fealty to him in person or to representatives appointed by him for that purpose. He returned by Dunfermline, St. Andrews, and Perth, with abbots and priors, barons and knights, free men and burghers coming to kneel before him, and arrived in Berwick in time to open, on the 3rd of August, the preliminary hearings of the Great Court case for the throne of Scotland. All this with such speed and panache that any resistance by unwilling Scots had no time to consolidate. The Great Court case was to become a showpiece trial by which not only Scotland and England, but all Europe were to be made aware with what detailed care and respect for legal opinion the matter was conducted. It was indeed a splendid facade. The court was composed of 104 auditors, 24 from Edward's council, 40 nominated by Robert the Competitor, and 40 nominated by John Belial. By the very nature of these appointments, it was clear that attention would be concentrated on the pleas of the 2 principal rivals, and that the claims of the other candidates were regarded as unsubstantial. Nevertheless, on the 3rd of August, all the competitors appeared before the king and lodged their petitions, each tracing his descent in detail from the royal ancestor through whom he made his claim. These petitions were sewn up in a leather bag, sealed with the seals of the bishops of Glasgow and St. Andrews, and the earls of Buchan and Mar, and then deposited in Berwick Castle. Thereupon King Edward, who had urgent business in England, adjourned the hearing until the 2nd of June 1292. On that date, the court reassembled and was adjourned once more until the 14th of October. Meanwhile, copies of the pedigrees had been sent to France to be considered by some of the greatest law scholars in Europe. The auditors began by debating the pleas of Bruce and Belial before entering on the claims at large. Both were descended from David, Earl of Huntingdon, brother of King William I the Lion, whose stock had ended with the Maid of Norway. David had left no sons behind him. His heirs were 3 daughters, whose living representatives were a grandson of the eldest daughter, John Belial, a son of the 2nd daughter, Robert the Competitor, and a grandson of the 3rd daughter, John Hastings, Lord of Abergavenny. John Belial claimed the throne as representative of the senior branch, Robert the Competitor as being the nearer descendant, with the further arguments that he had been nominated as heir by Alexander II, when that king was childless, and that he had the support of the 7 earls, who, by ancient right and tradition, had the power to elect a king. The scales of justice could be weighted either way by adequate precedents. The Frenchman Bonnet, the supreme authority at that time of canon law, gave as his opinion that the succession ought to go to the Clement, who was born first, even though he was descended from the younger line. And the Master General of the Franciscans came to the same conclusions, not on this ground, but as near in degree, citing from the Bible the unexpected precedent of the daughters of Zelophehad. On the other hand, the principle of primogeniture, although not yet established, was gradually gaining acceptance. King Edward at first inclined to Bruce and said so in private, but Anthony Beck, the shrewd Bishop of Durham, as Fordun reports, posed him his question. If Robert of Bruce were King of Scotland, where would Edward King of England be? For this Robert is of the noblest stock of all England, and together with him the kingdom of Scotland is very strong in itself, and in times gone by a great deal of mischief has been wrought to the kings of England by those of Scotland. At this the king, patting him on the head, as it were, answered in the French tongue, Parle cinq, Dieu vaut avaz bon chante, which is to say, by Christ's blood thou hast sung well. Things shall go otherwise than I arranged at first. The Scottish auditors, being unable to agree by what laws and customs the right of succession should be determined, referred the matter to those auditors appointed by the king. Each of these auditors, in turn, was interrogated by none less than the king himself. Aware by now of his wishes, and that as recently as April 1290, he had defined the rules of succession for the kingdom of England by seniority, they gave him the agreeable answer that judgment should be given by the laws and customs of England, and that as between the nearer descendant of the younger daughter and the more remote descendant of the elder daughter, the progeny of the elder daughter must be exhausted before that of the younger had any claim. On November the 6th, Bruce was informed that on the pleadings presented he had failed to make out his case. On November the 7th, by a document now in the British Museum, sealed by Bruce and Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester, he delegated his claim to the throne to his son, the Earl of Carrick, and his heirs. 2 days later, the Earl of Carrick, whose wife had died earlier in the year, resigned his earldom to his own son and heir, the 18-year-old Robert Bruce, the future king. Whatever the outcome of the court case, the Bruces were determined that their claim should remain on record. They made 2 further attempts to prevent the elevation of John Belial. On the 14th of June, 1292, Bruce the competitor had entered into an agreement with the Count of Holland, that if either should win the crown, he would hand over to the other as his fief a third part of the kingdom. The Count of Holland now came forward with the unlikely story that David, Earl of Huntingdon, on behalf of himself and his heirs, had resigned the rights to the Scottish throne in exchange for a grant of land, as Garroch in northeast Scotland, and that in consequence his stock was despaired. Whereas the Count was in direct descent from Ada, the sister of King William the Lion, and entitled to the throne. However, whether bribed by Belial, as his fellow Dutchmen believed, or not, after a short debate, he withdrew his plea. Finally, the Bruces threw their weight behind the claim of John Hastings, that Scotland was held of the king as any other fief under common law, and was therefore divisible between the 3 descendants of Earl David, and that in consequence they were entitled to a third share of the income and land. But the court had come to its decision. On the 17th of November 1292, in the great hall at Berwick, the king's judgment was read to the crowded assembly by his chief justice. Roger le Barbazon. Of the 13 competitors, 7 had withdrawn their claims, and 3 had been dismissed for want of prosecution. In regard to the remaining 3, the king pronounced that the kingdom of Scotland was indivisible, which cut out John Hastings, that the senior branch of Earl David's stock had precedence over the junior, which cut out the heirs of Robert the competitor, and that John Belial was heir at law to the vacant throne. It was at this stage that, according to Forlan, the Earl of Gloucester, holding Robert the Bruce by the hand, in the sight of all, spoke thus to the king: "Recollect, O king, what kind of judgment thou hast given today, and know that thou must be judged at the last." And straightway at the earl's bidding, the aforesaid Robert Bruce withdrew, nor did he ever tender homage of fealty to John of Belial. The great court case was over, but on the mind of the young Robert Bruce, now Earl of Carrick, who had listened to the many family conclaves during the years which had followed the death of Alexander III, was deeply imprinted the conviction that an injustice had been done, and that his grandfather was the rightful king of Scots. Formalities now followed each other pell-mell. On the 19th of November, the constables of those Scottish castles previously placed in Edward's hands were ordered to surrender them to John Belial, and the guardians of Scotland to hand over the realm. The great seal they had used was broken in four, and the fragments sent to the English treasury, and a fresh seal was cut for the new king. On the 20th of November, John Belial swore fealty for his kingdom as held of his superior lord. On the 30th of November, he was crowned at Scone by John St. John as deputy for the infant Earl of Fife, whose family held the hereditary right of crowning the monarch. And on the 26th of December, in his capacity as invested king, he once more rendered homage to his lord superior, as complete a vassal king as the documents of English jurists could make him. John Belial was king of Scotland, but this unfortunate man, pillar to posterity as Tom Tabard, the empty jacket, derived few benefits from his royal status. There was little of Scots about him. He was a native Picardy, with vast possessions in France. He was married to the daughter of John de Warrenne, Earl of Surrey, one of King Edward's leading military commanders, and had substantial landed interests in England. His only direct link with Scotland was his recent inheritance of the wild and unruly domain of Galloway, and the fact that his sister was married to a former guardian, John Comyn of Badenoch, head of the Red Comyns, the senior branch of a baronial family which vied with the Bruces as the most powerful influence in Scotland. A savage little vignette appears in the contemporary Wirshanga Chronicle. John Belial hurried to Scotland glittering in his crown, but the Scots, consenting or not, received him with extreme annoyance. They dismissed his attendants, familiar to him and of his own race, and deputed strangers to act as his administrators. But he, simple and stupid, almost mute and speechless, did not open his mouth. Thus he dwelt among them for a whole year, as a lamb among wolves. Within a week of his enthronement, this meek lamb experienced both the perfidy and pressure of his superior lord, a burgess of Berwick, who had lost his triple lawsuit in the court of the Scottish guardians, appealed to the King of England against their decision. There is suspicion of prearrangement about this action, for contrary to the usual law's delays, Edward had called in the record of the proceedings to his own court within the next fortnight, and reversed one of the judgments. Immediately Fraser, Bishop of St. Andrews, John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, Patrick Graham, and other supporters of Belial lodged a petition in the name of King John that Edward should keep to the promise he had made in Northampton in August 1290, and reiterated at Northam in June 1291 that he would preserve the laws and customs of Scotland, and should abide by the solemn agreement he had signed in the Treaty of Bergham, that no Scottish lawsuit should be dealt with outside the kingdom. To this, Edward roundly replied that any promises, concessions, or ratifications made during the interregnum, when the throne of Scotland was vacant, were, for the time being, only and that henceforward nothing ever placed on parchment should keep him from hearing appeals from Scotland, and that he would cite King John himself to appear before him if he so thought fit. So much for the integrity of a monarch who, on his gravestone, and engraved by a piece of prodigious irony, pactum servo, I keep my word. He followed up his outburst by extracting from the Scottish king, on the 2nd of January, 1293, 2 instruments, one in Latin, one in French, by which the Treaty of Berkham was declared null and void, and Edward was released from every article, concession, or promise therein contained. Nothing could more clearly demonstrate to the Scots what Edward understood by homage, and the rights that appertained, and they writhed in impotence. But worse humiliation was to follow. King Edward had a set of standing orders drawn up by his lawyers for the hearing of Scottish appeals of a character unheard of in the history of appellate justice. By these rules, the King of Scotland in person was required to attend in England the hearings of every appeal against him, and if the English court adjudged a miscarriage of justice, he was to be held personally liable for damages, both to the appellant and to his Lord Superior. The climax of this measured harassment was reached in October 1293 when King John was summoned to appear in person before the English Parliament to hear an appeal against him by John Macduff, younger son of Malcolm, Earl of Fife. On presenting himself as requested, he was treated with deliberate discourtesy and made to stand at the bar like a private malefactor. Stiffened before the ordeal by his counsellors, he showed at first a commendable firmness. He refused to answer to the charge on the grounds that he was King of Scotland, and dared not nor was able to act in any matter affecting his kingdom without the advice of the good men of his realm. Nor could he ask for any adjournment, for that would imply that he recognized the jurisdiction of those before whom he was cited. The court thereupon declared that he was guilty of extreme contempt in that it was directed against the sovereign who had conferred upon him the dignity of the crown, and that for this contumacy he should not only pay damages to the appellant, but should also hand over to the King of England the 3 principal castles in his realm, together with their attendant towns until he had purged his contempt. At this, King John's nerve failed him. Browbeaten by Edward and insulted by Parliament, he stood firm no longer. Before the court's resolution could be passed into a decree, he submitted a humble petition to his Lord Superior, craving that time should be given him to consult his subjects, and promising to report the result to the first Parliament after Easter. King Edward thereupon adjourned the next hearing to 14th of June, 1294. But as in the inexorable progress of a Greek tragedy, pride is followed by retribution, so now it happened to Edward. Philip the Fair of France had observed the arbitrary manner in which Edward had treated the Scots as a prerogative of his overlordship. With ironic malice, he decided to follow his example. Edward, in his capacity of Duke of Aquitaine, owed him fealty. Claiming that English seamen had attacked French ships without provocation, he cited Edward to appear in person before the Parliament in Paris, and there submit to the judgment of his Lord Superior. When Edward failed to attend, King Philip came down into the Parliament, pronounced him contumacious, and on the 19th of May, 1294, seized his lands in Gascony as forfeit. On the 24th of June, Edward retaliated by renouncing his homage as Duke and dispatched a formal declaration of war. The opportunity had now come for those smarting under his subjection to regain their independence. In September 1294, on the very eve of the Edward's departure from Portsmouth with his assembled forces for Gascony, the Welsh rose in revolt and compelled him to turn away from the expedition on which he had based his hopes of recovering his duchy. By May 1295, he had crushed the Welsh rebellion, but in the meantime the Scots, having lost all confidence in King John, had elected 4 bishops, 4 earls, and 4 barons to manage the government of the country in his name, and had sent commissioners to negotiate an alliance with France. On the 23rd of October 1295, an offensive and defensive league was concluded between the two countries, and this was ratified by the Scottish Parliament in February of 1296. But before this, Edward had got wind of the affair. He made an immediate decision that the conquest of Scotland had priority over that of Gascony, and with his accustomed energy, summoned his feudal host to meet him at Newcastle on the 1st of March 1296, and a fleet of ships to be assembled in East Anglia, and to sail along the east coast to join him on the same date. The Scottish Council, in the name of King John, issued a national call to arms for all free men to rendezvous at Cadonley, 4 miles north of Selkirk. During all the time since the rebuttal of their claims, the Bruces had played no part in the affairs of Scotland. Robert the Competitor retired from public life and remained quietly on his estates until his death on the 1st of April 1295. But not before he had signified his contempt for the new king by rigging, in the previous year, the election of his own nominee to the bishopric of Galloway in the face of royal objection. His son, determined not to compromise his claim to the throne by doing homage to Belial, departed in 1292 on a long visit to King Eric of Norway, accompanied by his eldest daughter Isabel. Within a year, she was married to her host, and her father remained at their court until he returned, on his own father's death, to succeed to the lordship of Annandale and the English states. In October 1295, he was appointed governor of Carlisle by King Edward. In his absence, his son and heir, Robert Bruce, the future king, to whom he had handed over the earldom of Carrick in November 1291, had become the virtual head of the lively and united family which remained in Scotland, consisting of his 4 brothers, Edward, Thomas, Alexander, and Nigel, and his 4 sisters, Mary, Christina, Matilda, and Margaret. During this time, he would have been in close contact with his grandfather, Robert the Competitor, and, on his behalf, visited the family's possessions in the Midlands and Essex, and paid his respects at the English court. There it must be assumed he found favor with King Edward, for loans from the royal exchequer were put at his disposal. It is probable that it was from London in September 1293 that he dispatched his magnificent wedding gift to his sister Isabel of Blue, scarlet and fur-trimmed gowns, bed linen, coverlets of gold and green, silver plate, and dishes for the table. Soon after his father's return in 1295, Robert married Isabel, daughter of the 10th Earl of Mar, whose great lands lay along the northeastern coast of Inverness. But it was a short-lived marriage, for after giving birth to a daughter, Marjorie, in 1296, Isabella died. When the call to arms was issued by King John, the conduct of the Bruces was clear and consistent. They had never recognized his coronation. They had never given up the hope of their succession to the Scottish throne. They had never paid homage to him. They abode by the vows of fealty they had made to King Edward in 1292, and reiterated in 1296, and he, in turn, to fasten their loyalty and excite their hopes, had promised that if the revolt was crushed and Belial deposed, the elder Bruce, now governor of Carlisle, should succeed to the Scottish throne. So they ignored the summons, as did the Earls of Angus and Dunbar, and many other magnates who followed their lead. In consequence, all were instantly deprived of their Scottish possessions. Those of the Bruces were handed out by Belial to his kinsmen, John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, only intensified an already bitter feud. The Scottish and English forces were gathering their strength when a love affair sparked off the conflict. Robert de Ross, an Englishman, Lord of Wark-on-Tweed, had fallen in love with a Scottish girl. As an earnest of his wish to marry her, he joined forces with her countrymen, and promised to deliver to him his castle. His brother, hearing of his purpose, sent an urgent request to King Edward for his help. An advance guard of the English was promptly dispatched, but Robert de Ros, with men from Roxburgh, fell upon them as they lay camped for the night and cut them to pieces. The first blood had been shed. "By God's blessing," exclaimed Edward when he heard the news, "as the Scots have begun, so shall I make an end." His army made a rapid advance to relieve Wark, and on the 17th of March 1296, King Edward made his quarters there and remained until after the celebration of Easter on the 25th of March. Elevated by this greatest of Christian festivals, both sides immediately proceeded to acts of unnecessary barbarity. On the 26th of March, leaving their country's eastern approaches unguarded, the Scots, under the Earl of Buchan, poured over the border at its western end, put to sword and flame the scattered villages on the English side, and swept to the walls of Carlisle in an attempt to take it by storm. But the gates were fast bolted by the Lord of Annandale, and the ramparts manned by the citizens under the command of his son, the Earl of Carrick. The Scots, having no siege engines, retraced their steps and a few weeks later turned east over the Cheviots and ravaged far and wide into Northumberland, burning churches, nunneries, and villages, and crowning their aimless exploits by the incineration of 200 little scholars in a school at Corbridge. From a military point of view, these raids were useless and did nothing to distract King Edward from his advance up the main eastern route to Scotland. As it was, he was able to transport his army unopposed over the Tweed, 20 miles upstream from Berwick, and invade the towns. An initial assault was made from the sea, but the forward-leading ships went aground, and the defenders, sallying forth, set them on fire and slew their crews. Elated by their success, they manned the precarious defenses of earthen mound and palisade, and jeered at the English and their king. But their confidence was ill-founded. Under King Edward's lead, his armored knights crashed through the rotting timbers, and drove their adversaries in disorder into the narrow streets and closes of the town. The foot soldiers followed, and dreadful slaughter ensued. On the orders of the king, that none should be spared, men, women, and children were hewn down in their thousands, and their corpses gave out a stench so overpowering that, when all was over, deep pits had to be dug to bury their remains. For 2 days the massacre continued until Edward, riding among his men, observed a woman in the very act of childbirth being put to the sword, and at last called off the carnage. Among the dead all honor must be given to the 30 Flemish merchants, who, in strict compliance to their ancient treaty with the Scottish crown, resisted fiercely in their depot, the Red Hall, until it was engulfed by flames and all were burned. The citadel alone remained intact, but the governor, Sir William Douglas, agreed to surrender himself as hostage so that the garrison might depart unharmed. The sack of Berwick, the pearl of Scotland's commerce, was a crippling blow to her revenues and trade. Never again was the town to recover its ancient eminence. Edward at once had marked it down as the headquarters of his Scottish administration. With feverish energy, he collected a vast workforce from the neighboring counties to surround it with massive fortifications. Edward himself set an example by personally shifting earth in a wheelbarrow, and brought up from the south English clerks and English merchants to replace the inhabitants, who now lay cluttered in a common grave. By a macabre coincidence, while the smoke still rose thinly from the smouldering ruins, a letter was brought by the abbot of Arbroath to King Edward, in which King John renounced his fealty. So late and so ineffective! "Oh, foolish knave, what folly he commits!" exclaimed the English king. "If he will not come to us, we will go to him." Learning that the Countess of Dunbar had handed over its castle to a Scottish force, while her husband was with the English, and that the Earl of Buchan was gathering a powerful host on the heights surrounding the town of Dunbar, he ordered his army, under the Earl of Surrey, to march northwards. The disciplined columns of the English came up with their opponents on the 27th of April, and began to deploy in the deep valley beneath the slopes of the Lammermuirs, on which the Scots were massed. in order to cross the intervening burn. Stalwart though the Scottish knights had shown themselves in many a tilt-yard, they had no experience of the tactics of serious warfare. As the English began to disappear into the dead ground below, they assumed they were seeking to escape. Breaking their ranks, they charged down the hillside in tumultuous rabble, only to meet an ordered battle line which overwhelmed them at the first onslaught. Thousands of Scottish foot soldiers were slain and the knights surrounded and made prisoner. Among those taken on the field of battle, and from the castle of Dunbar, were the greater part of the principal nobility who had supported Belial, and no organized resistance remained. The rest of Edward's campaign was a military promenade. Roxborough, Dumbarton, and Jedburgh Castle surrendered in quick succession, and Edinburgh Castle after 8 days. Stirling Castle was found abandoned with only a porter to hand over the keys, in unresisting Perth. Edward celebrated the feast of John the Baptist, and there received letters of abject submission from King John. On the 10th of July, this unhappy monarch appeared before his overlord at Montrose, and yielded to him his person and his kingdom, bewailing the errors into which he had fallen through evil counsel and our own simplicity, and in the presence of all assembled to witness his humiliation, had the blazon of the royal arms embroidered on his tabard ripped off and cast upon the floor. Tomb tabard, King Nobody was king no more. Leaving the Earl of Lancaster to transport his captive to the Tower of London, Edward made leisurely progress northward through Aberdeen and Banff as far as Elgin, to demonstrate his might and receive the homage of prominent Scots in the districts through which he passed. Returning by Perth, he commanded that the hallowed stone of destiny, upon which from generation to generation the kings of Scotland had been enthroned, should be taken from the Abbey church at Scone and delivered to Westminster Abbey. The plunder of this sacred relic and the royal regalia, which he had already removed from Edinburgh Castle, were arrogant signals to all in Scotland that henceforth their country was not a kingdom, but a dependent part of England. On the 28th of August, he held a parliament at Berwick, to which every landholder in Scotland was summoned to appear, with signed and sealed instruments of fealty, the Ragman roll, not to a new king of Scotland. "Have we nothing else to do but win kingdoms for you?" he replied scornfully to the Lord of Annandale's reminder of the promise of a throne. But to Edward, King of England, he had at last achieved the object to which he had been moving, step, by cunning and by force, the incorporation into one kingdom of England, Wales and Scotland. He remained for 3 weeks in Berwick, ordering the administration of his new province. Scotsmen were no longer to be governed by Scotsmen, but by Englishmen with no lineal or landed ambitions in that area. The Earl of Surrey was made viceroy, Sir Hugh Cressenham treasurer, Sir Walter of Amersham chancellor, and Sir William Ormsby chief justice. The castles throughout Scotland were garrisoned by English troops. The church benefices filled with English priests, the day-to-day business controlled by English bureaucrats from their headquarters in Berwick, Scotland, bereft of its natural leaders, who were either immured in English prisons or drawn by the pull of their English possessions to Edward's camp, appeared prostrate at his feet. Chapter 5. In the autumn of 1296, Edward returned to England to deal with the problems of the French war, disdainfully remarking as he crossed the border that it was a good job to be shot of shit. His satisfaction was premature. The fall of Berwick, the collapse at Dunbar, the abject figure of John Belial, the unopposed progress through the burghs of his new conquest, had given him and his lieutenants a false impression of the people they now proposed to govern. The Earl of Surrey was so unconcerned about his duties as Viceroy of Scotland that he retired to his Yorkshire estates, leaving the direction of affairs to Hugh de Cressingham. This portly ecclesiastic, sensual and money-loving, concentrated his energies on extracting from the subjects Scots, by taxes and sequestration, funds which his master so urgently required for the war against France. He was ably abetted by William Ormsby, the Chief Justice, who, with a dog-like fidelity, hunted out all who had not signed instruments of fealty, proclaimed them outlaws, and seized their properties and goods. But Scotland had been stunned and not subdued. A growing band of outraged and dispossessed men took refuge in the forests and mountains of their native land. The pent-up resentment of a proud and spirited race, smoldering like a peat fire below the surface, burst into flame, and by May 1297, the whole of Scotland, outside Lothian, was in revolt, led by two outstanding men, Andrew Moray and William Wallace. Andrew Moray had been captured at Dunbar together with his father, Sir Andrew Moray, and his uncle, escaping from his prison in Chester. He made his way to the hereditary lands of his family in the Month, the great mountainous mass which divides the Spey River from the Tay. There he raised the standard of rebellion at his father's castle at Avoch, and to him rallied not only the warlike men of Moray, but also the burghers of Inverness, under Alexander Pilch. Together they so harried and ambuscaded the English that anguished cries for help were sent to King Edward. Down in the Selkirk forest William Wallace, son of a knightly family from the parish of Paisley, was living an outlaw life, since neither he nor his eldest brother, Sir Malcolm, had bowed their heads at Berwick. A giant of a man with a mane of brown hair and piercing eyes, Wallace had become a magnet for the discontented. He had recently married a young woman who lived in Lanark, visiting her by stealth. As a marked man, he clashed with an English patrol. Fighting his way clear, he retreated to her house, and as his pursuers hammered on the front door, he escaped by the back to the rocky Cartland crags. Enraged by the failure to capture him, Sir William Heselrigg, Sheriff of Lanark, ordered the house to be burnt, and all within it, wife and servants, to be put to the sword. From that day, Wallace vowed an undying vengeance against the English. Gathering together a band of desperate men, he fell by night on the sheriff and his armed guard, hewed the sheriff into small pieces with his own sword, and burned the buildings and those within them. For the first time, one of the high officials of the hated conquerors had been slain, and a ripple of jubilation spread throughout the oppressed. Men flocked to Wallace's banner, and with a growing force, he turned eastward to where the Chief Justice was holding his courts at Scone. On the way, there he was joined by that stormy petrel, Sir William Douglas, late commander of the castle at Berwick, with a body of mounted men, leaving the foot soldiers to follow. Wallace and Sir William, with all the horsemen of the party, galloped ahead in the hope of surprising the Chief Justice at his sessions. But in the nick of time, he was warned of their approach, and fled in the clothes he stood up in, relinquishing to his attackers a rich haul of booty. The gesture of Sir William was typical of the man, crusader, warrior, egoist. He had gone his own way throughout his life with very little regard for anyone else. He had flouted the guardians of the interregnum, and insulted the authority of King Edward by abducting and forcibly marrying Eleanor de Ferrers, an English widow, while she was staying with relatives in Scotland. Nevertheless, in that heraldic age, the adherents of this great nobleman immediately conferred on Wallace's band of outlaws the cachet of respectability, Sir William Douglas's kinship to the family of Moray, and the fact that his first wife was the sister of James Stuart, Wallace's feudal lord, linked the two areas of insurrection. Behind his move, it is reasonable to discern the fine hand of Robert Wishart, Bishop of Glasgow. Nobody was more opposed to the domination of England than the Scottish Church, and this opposition had been intensified since the Parliament of Berwick by King Edward's repeated presentations of English priests to Scottish benefices. Nobody had a better network of communication to direct and coordinate subversive activities. Both these aspects were personified in the frail body of the bishop. He had pledged his fealty to King Edward at Berwick, but for him, The church came first, and he regarded his recurrent pledges as no more than pawns in the struggle, given under duress, discarded, without compunction, whenever the defense of his country required it, for he remembered, only too well, the blatant manner in which the English king had repudiated his most solemn promises. As news of the spreading revolt reached him on the ecclesiastical grapevine, he turned his attention to his fellow guardian in the days of the interregnum, James Stuart. This cautious man, with his vast possessions in Butte, Kyle Stuart and Renfrew, Teviot Dale, Lauderdale, and Lothian, his hereditary position as royal steward, his freedom from any distracting landholdings in England, his overlordship of William Wallace, had for weeks been hovering on the edges of a decision. The example of his neighbor and relative, Sir William Douglas, the return of Wallace to the west where he chased the cocksure Anthony Beck, Bishop of Durham, from the episcopal palace in Glasgow, and trapped and burned an English garrison in Ayr, together with the urgings of Bishop Wishart, proved decisive. Early in June 1297, at the same time as Macduff of Fife, a son of an Earl of Fife, and his two sons raised their standard of revolt in the east, he summoned his knights to take the field against the English and join him at the town of Irvine in the west. When news of Sir William Douglas's defection reached King Edward, he was deeply involved in English problems. Knowing of all the contrariness of his opinionated knight, he did not take the matter seriously enough to alert the English forces, but sent orders to the governor of Carlisle, the elder Bruce, to instruct his son to muster the men of Annandale, and with them proceed to the Douglas lands and seize the Douglas castle. So Robert Bruce, the young Earl of Carrick, rode from Carlisle to Annan and Lochmaben to summon his father's vassals, and when he had gathered a sufficient force together, drew up to the Douglas stronghold. During his journey, there he had much on which to ponder. His father had always been a follower of King Edward, more at home with the civilities of the English court and the blander climate of his English estates than with the rougher life of the north. But Robert Bruce was Scottish-born and Scottish-bred. With his brothers and sisters he had roamed the Carrick lands of his Celtic mother, or ridden beside his tough old grandfather through the hills and valleys of Annandale. He had played his part indeed on the English side, and in return had been granted a postponement of his debt repayments to the English exchequer. But that was when he was ranged against the Comyns for whom John Belial had confiscated the Bruce estates in Scotland. Now the Comyns and John Belial were captives, and the leaders who had taken the field against the English in Ayrshire were the very men who had supported his grandfather's claim to the Scottish throne. That claim Bruce had never forgotten, brought up in the knowledge that in his veins ran the royal blood of the House of Canmore. Convinced of the injustice of the court decision which had denied his family their regal inheritance, his abiding ambition was to retrieve the crown his grandfather had struggled for and lost. That purpose dominated his actions. Hitherto it had been served by Edward I's promise to Bruce's father, that the Scottish throne would be his when Belial was deposed. But Edward had reneged. The Scottish throne had been incorporated in that of England. The single devil Belial had been swept away, only to be replaced by the sevenfold devil of the Plantagenet king. By assuming the sovereignty of Scotland, Edward I had become the chief obstacle to Bruce's objective, and the catalyst to refuse the two elements in Bruce's nature, his love of his native land and his determination to rule it. So, as he rode up the long valley of Annandale, this young man of 22, already admired by men for his skill at arms, and by women for his courtesy, took the crucial decision of his life. When he reached the castle, which was held by Sir William's wife, he called his followers around him. "No man," he said, "holds his flesh and blood in hatred, and I am no exception. I must join my own people and the nation in which I was born, Choose then whither you go with me, or return to your homes." Many of the knights who accompanied him were vassals of his father, who was still pledged to King Edward, and decided that they must abide by their overlord's allegiance, and so departed. But with those who were left and with the men of Douglas and Lady Douglas, who had been advised of his decision, he moved northeastward through his domain of Carrick, gathering recruits as he went, and joined the steward and the bishop at Irvine. Many of the knights who accompanied him were vassals of his father, who was still pledged to King Edward, and decided that they must abide by their overlord's allegiance, and so departed. But with those who were left, and with the men of Douglas and Lady Douglas, who had been advised of his decision, he moved northeastward through his domain of Carrick, gathering recruits as he went, and joined the steward and the bishop at Irvine. Meanwhile, the humiliated Anthony Beck had alerted King Edward to the strength of the insurrection. On the 4th of June, the king empowered Henry Percy and Robert Clifford, the two foremost barons in the border shires, to raise levies from Lancaster, Westmoreland, and Cumberland, to arrest, imprison, and try all disturbers of the peace in Scotland, and instructed all sheriffs and castle governors to give them every aid. With commendable speed, the two commanders collected a powerful body of armed knights, and, moving fast along the Annandale and Nithsdale route, reached toward the end of June the English-held castle of Ayr, a few miles south of Irvine, where the Scottish forces were encamped. No battle ensued. Almost as soon as Percy and Clifford had dismounted, envoys arrived under a flag of truce to ask if they had authority to treat with the Scottish leaders. Dissension had broken out in the Irvine camp, between those who supported Belial and those who supported Bruce. Andrew Moray and William Wallace were fighting in the name of John Belial, whom they still regarded as king, and may well have been skeptical of young Bruce's sudden conversion to the Scottish cause. Bishop Wishart, James Stewart, his brother John, and Alexander Lindsay considered that, by his abdication, John Belial had renounced his rights, and that Robert Bruce's father was the natural successor to the Scottish crown, and the true focus for the upsurge for independence. Sir William Douglas agreed with nobody. Moray and Wallace preferred to fight on their own terms, and in their own centres of resistance, and departed forthwith. Without their support, the forces of Stewart and Bruce were in no position to make headway against the English invasion. Their men were mainly foot soldiers. Those of the English were armed knights. The contest would be glaringly unequal, and a defeat damaging to the growing confidence of the Scottish people. News had reached Scotland of a clash between King Edward, his church, and his barons. The Archbishop of Canterbury had instructed his clergy to pay no taxes on pain of excommunication, and the two great magnates in England, Roger Bigod, Earl of Norfolk, the Earl Marshal, and Humphrey Bohun, Earl of Hereford, the Constable, had refused to serve overseas, retiring to their fiefs and calling up their vassals. Many other of the barons had followed their example. There was the possibility of civil war in England. The forces of Percy and Clifford were the only English armed troops in the field. It was a time to keep them engaged in negotiations so that Moray and Wallace could pursue their activities undisturbed by attack. Such must have been the reasoning which led the subtle bishop and canny steward to ask for parley. Percy and Clifford, in their turn, were aware of the uncertain situation in England, and had no desire unnecessarily to hazard forces, reluctantly conscripted, which they might desire at home. So talks began. After days of discussion, the English made certain promises, and on the 9th of July, 1297, the Scottish leaders agreed to surrender to King Edward's pleasure and produce hostages as pledges of good faith. Bruce, in particular, was required to hand over his infant daughter, Marjorie, but it is clear that he was unwilling to do this. The bishop, the steward, and Sir Alexander Lindsay took it upon themselves to act as sureties on his behalf. In the upshot, Sir William Douglas failed to produce his hostages on the appointed day. and was imprisoned in Berwick Castle, where, wrote Henry Percy, he was very savage and very abusive. A year later he died, leaving behind a son of 3 years, James Douglas, who was to become the most famous and devoted of all the followers of Robert Bruce, the future king. Sir Alexander Lindsay made his own peace. The bishop was held prisoner. Robert Bruce and James Stewart neither surrendered nor produced hostages, and remained at large, deprived of their lands. Bruce's father was relieved of his post as governor of Carlisle, and retired to his English estates, where he remained until his death in 1304. After the capitulation of the nobles at Irvine, the leadership of resistance remained entirely in the hands of Moray and Wallace, and their efforts were attended with such success that on the 10th of July, Hugh de Cressingham wrote to the deputy treasurer in London that not one of the sheriffs, bailiffs, or the officials of the Lord King can at this time raise a penny of the revenues of their bailiwicks on account of the multitude of different perils which daily and continually threaten them. And a fortnight later, in still more urgent tones, to the king, "By far, the greatest part of your counties in the Scottish kingdom are still not provided with keepers because they have been killed, besieged, or imprisoned, or have abandoned their bailiwicks and dare not go back. And in some shires, the Scots have appointed and established bailiffs and officials. Thus no shire is properly kept save for Berkshire and Roxburghshire, and they only recently." With many of his barons hostile, King Edward was desperately trying to raise an army to cross to Flanders in support of the Count of that country, with whom he had formed an alliance against France. When he received Cressingham's request, he had no English to spare for Scotland. He therefore released a number of the Scottish nobles, among them the Earl of Buchan and Alexander Combian, whom he had captured at Dunbar on condition that they returned to their fiefs, to quell the disturbances, and then followed him overseas with their feudal levies. But when the noblemen arrived in Scotland, they found the disturbances very much more serious than they had expected. They sent various messages to King Edward, expressing their loyalty and hopes of success, but in practice they remained inactive, waiting to see how matters would evolve and taking no steps to prevent their retainers drifting away to join the insurgents. Hugh de Cressingham had no doubt that they were playing a double game, and warned the king to give no credence to their protestations. As an English chronicler shrewdly remarks, even when the lords were present with the king in body, at heart they were on the opposite side. By early August, Moray had broken out of the mouth and seized all the English-held castles in the north, including Inverness, Elgin, and Banff. Sir Henry Lotham, Sheriff of Aberdeenshire, had joined in the revolt and handed over the castle at Aberdeen. Wallace, having built up his forces in the forest of Selkirk, moved northeast after the capitulation of Irvine, cleared Perthshire and Fife, and, after making contact with Moray on the Tay, settled down to besiege the castle of Dundee. The whole area north of the Firth of Forth, with few exceptions, was in Scottish hands. At last, the Earl of Surrey, whom King Edward had appointed his viceroy in Scotland, bestirred himself. He was now an elderly man, whose long military experiences had taught him that foot soldiers in their hundreds and could be scattered like chaff by a handful of armed knights. He had little doubt that with the Scottish lords, the core of their chivalry, sitting on the sidelines or in prison, or in the retine of his master, he would brush aside the common folk of Moray and Wallace like a fly from his face. Marshalling at Berwick a formidable host of heavy cavalry and footmen, he marched towards Stirling, where the crossing of the Forth was the key to the north. On hearing news of his approach, Moray and Wallace joined forces and moved south to defend this vital position. One cannot admire enough the courage and determination of these two young men, who were going to pit their inferior forces, woefully lacking in mounted men, against the armed might of a rich and powerful kingdom. The posture they took up bore all the marks of brilliant generalship. Overlooking a loop of the Forth River, which was crossed by a single bridge, was an abrupt rock, the Abbey Crag, from which a neck of ground led back to the nearby Oakhill Hills, giving a safe retreat in the event of failure. Below the northern exit of the bridge in the causeway that prolonged it was an area of boggy ground almost entirely encircled by the Forth. On this crag, the Scottish commanders deployed their men. The English forces spent the nights of 9 and 10 September on the south side of the river. They were supremely self-confident. Hugh de Cressingham had already advised Percy and Clifford that there was no need for their additional support. James Stewart and the Earl of Lennox, who had been hovering on the outskirts with a troop of cavalry, uncertain whether to join Moray and Wallace, rated equally low the chances of the Scottish forces. To avoid a butchery of their countrymen, they approached the Earl of Surrey with the suggestion that they should inaugurate a parley. The Earl agreed, but Stewart and Lennox returned from the Scottish leaders with a blank refusal. 2 Dominican friars were then dispatched to Moray, and Wallace with offers of generous retreatment. "If they yield, tell your commander," was the reply, "that we are not here to make peace, but to do battle to defend ourselves and liberate our kingdom. Let them come, and we shall prove this in their very beards." Sir Richard London, a Scottish knight, who had gone over to the English from Irvine in disgust at the dissension in the Scottish camp, asked the Earl of Surrey to send him upriver with a detachment to a ford where he could cross with 60 men abreast and take the Scotsmen in the rear. But his suggestion was ignored, and the Earl retired to bed. At dawn, on the 11th of September, a party of English infantry were sent over the narrow bridge, but were recalled because the Earl had overslept. Hugh de Cressingham, fuming with impatience, urged that no more time should be wasted, and the Earl gave him the order to cross. Riding arrogantly 2 by 2, the cavalry were led by him over the bridge. From early in the morning until 11 o'clock, the column moved forward until Moray and Wallace decided that the time had come to split the English army. The main force of the Scots fell upon the leading ranks on the causeway, while a picked body of men seized the bridgehead and began to cut away its timbers. Jostled from the causeway, the heavy horses of the armed knights plunged and wallowed in the deep mire on either side, unable to maneuver or charge, tumbling their riders to the ground. Behind them, their comrades on the south side were powerless to help them, for the bridge was destroyed. A bloody massacre took place. Hugh de Cressingham met his fate at the hands of the Scottish spearmen. His body was flayed, and his skin in small pieces was sent throughout the country as tokens of liberation from the accursed regime of which he was the symbol. Only Sir Marmaduke Twang managed to hew his way through his opponents and take refuge in the castle of Stirling. The Earl of Surrey had not crossed the bridge. Aghast at the slaughter beyond it, he lost his nerve and galloped in such haste to the border that his horse had nothing to eat between Stirling and Berwick, and foundered on arrival. The rank and file and the baggage trains of the English were less fortunate than their commander. As they retreated down the road to Falkirk, James Stewart and the Earl of Lennox, who was lurking in the woods on either side until the issue had been decided, poured out with their men to kill the fleeing groups and seize the laden wagons of booty. The repercussions of the English defeat were immense. For the first time, an army of professional knights had been overcome by the common folk. The dissenting barons in England were so shocked that they patched up an agreement with the Regency, who were ruling in the absence of the king abroad, and all talk of civil war was suspended. In northeast Scotland, the Earl of Strathearn, the Earl of Buchan, and the Comyns and other noblemen in that area, who had been making face-saving gestures to suppress the patriots, threw off their allegiance to the English crown. In the southwest, Robert Bruce, who had gone to ground after the capitulation of Irvine, emerged to rouse the men of Carrick and Galloway to such effect that Sir Robert Clifford made 2 punitive expeditions before and after Christmas 1297, from Carlisle to Annandale, to try to check his activities. Outside the strongest castles all English resistance seized, Moray and Wallace were masters of the realm. But Moray had been severely wounded at Stirling Bridge. He survived long enough to send a letter in his name, and that of Wallace on the 11th October 1297, to the mayors of the communes of Lubeck and Hamburg, that the kingdom of Scotland had, by God's grace, recovered by battle from the power of the English, and that, in consequence, the ports of Scotland were once more open to their merchants. But soon afterwards he succumbed to his wounds. A famous folk hero, William Wallace, was now to take upon his shoulders the sole government of the realm. Behind him was the church, manning the chancellery, the civil service of that time, which had been displaced by King Edward, but now returned to its administrative duties. The common folk of the land followed him as their leader and ruler. But the most striking tribute to his personality and preeminence was the drawing together of the feuding magnates under the leadership in a common front against the English. In March 1298, in the forest of Selkirk, which Wallace had made the base of his armed forces, the earls, barons, and knights, the bishops, abbots, and friars who were then in Scotland, met to resolve the future of the realm. In the presence of them all, William Wallace was dubbed knight by Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, and by the general voice of those assembled proclaimed guardian of the kingdom. From that date edicts were issued in the name of William Wallace, Knight, Guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland and Commander of its armies in the name of the famous Prince, Lord John, by God's grace, illustrious King of Scotland, by consent of the community of that realm. Between the Battle of Stirling and the Forest Parliament, Wallace had led his army south. There was famine in the Lowlands. To gain corn and cattle he ravaged the northern counties of England from late October 1297 into the new year, until snowstorms and severe frost forced him back to Scotland laden with immense spoil. During that time, writes the English chronicler Gusberog, the praise of God ceased in all the monasteries and churches of the whole province from Newcastle upon Tyne to Carlisle. For all the monks, canons, regular and other priests, the servants of the Lord had fled, with one may say, the whole of the common folk from the face of the Scots. During the absence of Wallace on this campaign, Bishop Fraser of St. Andrews, who had remained in France since the Parliament at Berwick in 1296, disenchanted by and hostile to King Edward, passed away. Acting on Wallace's instructions, the St. Andrews chapter elected in his place the Chancellor of Glasgow Cathedral, William Lamberton, friend and compatriot of Bishop Wishart. He was to become one of the key figures in opposition to English rule. Meanwhile, King Edward had been having little success in Flanders, to which he had sailed on the 22nd of August 1297. Matters had come to a stalemate, and on the 9th of October, a short armistice was signed between France and England, which was then prolonged to the 6th of January 1299. King Edward had now the opportunity to turn his attention to Scotch affairs. He landed in England on the 14th of March 1298, and by the 25th of May had transferred the headquarters of government to York, where it remained for the next 6 years. Scotland was to become the obsession of his remaining life, and even beyond the grave, for it is said he gave instructions that on his tomb should be inscribed the vengeful words, "The hammer of the Scots." Such a hammer he now began to fashion. Writs were sent to his tenants-in-chief to join him with their vassals, horses, and arms. Other armed knights were recruited at his own expense. A corps of Gascon lords, knights, and crossbowmen were summoned from the duchy. Orders were given for the paid conscription of numerous Welshmen, archers, and footmen. A fleet of ships was commissioned to ensure supplies. Reconciliation was arranged with the recalcitrant Earls of Hereford and Norfolk, respectively Constable and Earl Marshal of the kingdom, and the powerful forces were put at his disposal. A wave of patriotic fervor supported his preparations. From ecclesiastical pens issued a stream of propaganda. Wallace was depicted as an ogre of unspeakable depravity, who skinned his prisoners alive, burned babies, and forced the nuns of the Holy Church to dance naked before him. So when King Edward mustered his troops at Roxburgh on the 25th of June, some 2,500 heavy cavalry and 12,000 foot had answered his summons. This vast army, with its attendant baggage train, set off along the Lauderdale route to Edinburgh, the clank of armored knights, the tramp of footmen, the creak of wagon wheels sounded in a silent land from which man and beast had vanished. There was neither fodder, nor food, nor information to be found. The inhabitants had fled to the forest, driving their cattle and sheep before them, leaving behind a scorched and wasted land. By the 15th of July, the English army had reached Kirkliston, beyond Edinburgh. Here King Edward learnt that Dirleton and 2 other castles in East Lothian were held by the Scots and sent Anthony back to capture them while he remained encamped. The whereabouts of Wallace and his men was still unknown. The food ships due at Leith had been delayed by contrary winds, and the army was faced with starvation. The few ships that had struggled through happened to carry only barrels of wine. When this was issued to raise the spirits of the troops, the effect on the empty stomachs of the Welshmen, who always got the worst of the meager rations, was disastrous. They got very drunk, brawled with the English soldiers, killed some, and were killed in turn, and then grew mutinous and threatened to decamp to the enemy. The whole expedition was in danger of collapse. Indeed, King Edward had already decided to return to Edinburgh when the tide of fortune, due no doubt to the intervention of St. John of Beverley, to whose shrine the king had made a pilgrimage on his way north, turned miraculously in his favor. Anthony Beck returned with the news that Dirleton had surrendered, and that the other 2 castles had been abandoned by their defenders. The food ships had made harbor at Leith, and a message was received from the Earl of Dunbar that the Scots were only 13 miles away in Callender Wood based Falkirk. A wave of elation swept through the army. All discord ceased. The quarry had been viewed. The hunt was on. Immediately breaking camp, King Edward led his troops along the road to Falkirk and bivouacked just east of Linlithgow, each man sleeping on the ground with his horse beside him, the king among his men, the horses tasting nothing but cold iron, champing their bits. In the dead of night, a cry of alarm aroused the sleeping warriors. The king had been trampled upon by his charger and was injured, but the king, despite 2 broken ribs, had himself hoisted into his high back saddle and set his knights in motion through Linlithgow in the early light of morning. They had not gone far when the rising sun glinted on lances lining the top of a nearby hill, but as they pressed toward them the spearmen melted away. It was not until they reached the bank of the West Quarter burn, where a halt was called for the king and Anthony Beck, Bishop of Durham, to hear mass, that they saw in full daylight Wallace deploying his troops on the slope of Slaman Moor. Wallace's main anxiety was the overwhelming superiority of the English cavalry, and he made his dispositions with this in mind. Immediately to his front was a boggy marsh, to his right scattered woodland, and rocks on his left, the deepening valley of the burn. On the hard ground behind the marsh, he drew up his men in 4 ciltrons, packed circles of spearmen drawn up with their long spears slanting outward, with butt on earth, and the front rank kneeling. Round each ciltron wooden stakes were driven into the ground and roped together. Between the ciltrons he lined the Ettrick archers, equipped with their short bows, under the command of John Stewart, brother of James Stewart. On the crest of the hill behind he placed his slender force of cavalry, contributed by several earls, too few to be effective in attack, but of decisive value in pursuit of a demoralized foe. Wallace's logical action would have been to retreat before the English army, wasting their land as he went, and let hunger defeat the enemy, but there is reason to believe that he was overruled by his impatient troops, and hence his famous valediction, "I have brought you to the ring, hop if you can." On the English side, King Edward divided his cavalry in 4 brigades of some 600 knights each, the first under the Earls of Hereford, Norfolk, and Lincoln, the second under Anthony Beck, Bishop of Durham, the third under his own command, and the fourth in reserve under the Earls of Arundel, Gloucester, Oxford, and Pembroke. He proposed, before joining battle, that there should be a pause during which men and horses, none of whom had eaten for 24 hours, should be fed, but his commanders were chafing for action, and he yielded to their importunity. The 1st Brigade charged immediately to their front, but, checked by the bog, swung leftward in a half-circle. The 2nd Brigade swung likewise in a half-circle to the right, and the 2 horns converged behind the Siltrons and scattered the Scottish cavalry who fled into the woods behind. Then, turning inwards, they overwhelmed the Scottish archers, whose arrows were not powerful enough to penetrate their armor, and slew their commander, John Stuart. The Siltrons were left exposed. Again and again, they were charged by the mounted knights, but their ranks remained unbroken. It was then that King Edward ordered up the Welsh longbowmen, and the crossbowmen and slingmen of Gascony. A deadly hail of arrows, bolts, and stones was poured into the Siltrons until the gaps in their ranks became too wide to be filled, and the mail-clad knights broke into the weakened rings. Once the human fortress was breached, hundreds upon hundreds of the Scottish foot were slain. Macduff and his 2 sons, who had faithfully supported Wallace since they took arms against the English in 1297, were left dead upon the field. Wallace escaped into the surrounding woods with a handful of followers. The Battle of Falkirk was notable for 2 innovations that were profoundly to affect military tactics until the introduction of gunpowder. Wallace's hedgehog of spears shattered forever the accepted principle that the footman was always at the mercy of the mounted knight. This was again triumphantly disproved at Courtrai, 4 years later, when the pikemen of Flanders, with no long bow against them, broke the chivalry of France. King Edward's brilliant riposte, by switching from hand-to-hand fighting to the long-range missile, marked the beginning of modern war, and, when properly exploited, gave to England its great victories at Crecy and Agincourt in succeeding reigns. King Edward had won a battle and destroyed the authority of William Wallace, but otherwise his expedition was profitless. Like Napoleon in Russia some 500 years later, he had come unprepared for a situation in which people of the invaded land, through their own material loss, destroyed everything which could be of service to him. He was desperately short of supplies and unable to carry his pursuit further north. After resting a fortnight in deserted Stirling, while his ribs knit together, meanwhile sending a raiding party to set fire to Perth and St. Andrews, which had been abandoned by the Scots as they retired beyond the Tay, he turned back towards his base at Carlisle, with the intention of rounding up Robert Bruce and his men on the way. But Bruce, who had been making sporadic raids in the southwest from his headquarters in Ayr, was warned of his approach and slipped away into the wilds of Carrick, after burning the town and destroying its castle. When King Edward arrived, he found an empty shell. He proposed immediate pursuit, but his army was already short of commons. His tenants-in-chief, who had done unpaid service, demanded leave to depart, and he was left with no choice but to fall back on Carlisle, which he reached on the 8th of September. After seizing Lochmaben Castle, the ancestral home of the Bruces, which lay across his route. From Carlisle, as his followers dispersed for the winter, he sent out fresh summons to reassemble an army at the town on the 6th of June, 1299, to renew the struggle. Chapter 6. After Falkirk, the guardianship of the country returned into the hands of the Magnates. William Wallace had no fief and no vassals behind him. His leadership had depended upon his aura of success, and when that was dissipated, he had no platform of recovery. For the next 7 years he remained in obscurity, harrying the English whenever he could with bands of lawless men, or acting as messenger to the King of France, or His Holiness the Pope for his friend William Lamberton, Bishop of St. Andrews. But something of his unselfish dedication to the cause of Scotland brushed off, for a short time, on the feuding barons. The new guardians were Robert Bruce, leader of the resistance in the southwest, and John Comyn, the Red, of Badenoch, kinsman of the Earl of Buchan, and representative of the preeminent family beyond the Tay. It was a surprising and uneasy alliance, and argues generosity of mind and patriotism on the part of Robert Bruce, for the Guardians were still acting in the name of the abdicated king, John Belial, and thus effectively blocking his family's claim to the throne. Under the Guardians' rule, the normal machinery of government continued to operate throughout the major part of Scotland, for in spite of the Scottish defeat at Falkirk, the English had not sufficient troops to occupy the country, and from 1298 to 1303, the only area under their full control was East Lothian, where their garrisoned castles were thicker on the ground than in other parts. It was against Roxburgh, the most westerly of these, that the Scots made their first full-scale raid in July 1299. The assembled forces of the two Guardians and those of the Earls of Buchan, Menteith, and Athol, and of James Stewart, Sir Robert Keith, Sir Ingram de Umfraville, and other barons, were accompanied by the bishops of St. Andrews, who had newly returned from France after evading the ships which King Edward had detailed to intercept him. The Scottish attack was abortive. The castle was too strongly held to be taken without heavy casualties, and these were unwilling to risk in view of the preparations that King Edward was putting in train to renew the conflict. They returned to Pebbles in the forest of Selkirk to consider their next move. Frustrated and quarrelsome after the failure of their expedition, they were soon at odds, as can be noted from the report of a spy planted among them by the Constable of Roxburgh Castle, which is now preserved in the Public Record Office in London. At the council, Sir David Graham demanded the lands and goods of Sir William Wallace because he was leaving the kingdom without the leave or approval of the Guardians, and Sir Malcolm, Sir William's brother, answered that neither his lands nor his goods should be given away, for they were protected by the peace in which Wallace had left the kingdom. At this, the two knights gave the lie to each other and drew their daggers. And since Sir David Graham was of Sir John Comyn's following, it was reported to the Earl of Buchan and John Comyn that a fight had broken out without their knowing it, and John Comyn leapt at the Earl of Carrick and seized him by the throat, and the Earl of Buchan turned on the Bishop of St. Andrews, declaring that treason and lèse-majesté was being plotted. Eventually the Steward and others came between them and quieted them. At that moment, a letter was brought from beyond the Firth of Forth, telling how Sir Alexander Comyn and Lachlan MacRutchy were burning and devastating the district they were in, attacking the people of the Scottish nation. So it was ordained, then, that the Bishop of St. Andrews should have all the castles in his hands as principal captain, and the Earl of Carrick and John Comyn be with him as joint guardian of the kingdom, and that same Wednesday, after the letter had been read, they all left Peebles. For the time being, the old feud between Bruce and Comyn was patched up by the influence of the bishop, whose whole thought was for the liberty of the kingdom and the independence of the church. His bishopric was north of the Tay and Comyn land. His career had hitherto been in the southwest, the preserve of the Bruces, so no better link between the two could have been chosen. The Comyns returned to their homeland to deal with their erring relative, and Bruce to Annandale in an attempt, which proved unsuccessful, to regain his hereditary castle of Lochmaben. Lamberton, Umfraville, and Keith remained in Selkirk Forest to watch the southern approaches, and other forces were placed under the command of Sir John Soulis to besiege the English garrison in Stirling Castle, which had been left behind by King Edward after his victory at Falkirk. In November, news was brought to the Scots that King Edward was raising an army to rescue the beleaguered defenders, and the scattered guardians came together at the Torwood, near Stirling, to protect Sir John and his men against the threatened invasion. But their support was not needed. The levy ordered by King Edward to foregather at Berwick to raise the siege of Stirling was ignored. The military tenants of Anthony Beck, Bishop of Durham, his right-hand man, refused to serve beyond their shire, and other desertions were so serious that Edward could not proceed, so the castle fell to the Scots. Heartened by this display of weakness, the guardians wrote to King Edward that, through the mediation of King Philip of France, they would agree to a truce. But the king peremptorily refused, and on the 30th of December 1299 issued further writs for a full and formally constituted feudal levy to meet him at Carlisle on the 24th of June 1300. Before then, the temporary advantage enjoyed by the Scots was dissipated by renewed dissension among the guardians. The Comyn faction argued that the main effort against the English should be directed in support of the men of Galloway, but this was unacceptable to Bruce and his friends. The men of Galloway were a law unto themselves, and the sustaining thread through their history was a traditional hatred of the men of Carrick, dating from the quarrels between Gilbert and Uhtred, the sons of Fergus, a century before. Ever since the abdication of their titular lord, John Belial, they had spent as much time raiding their neighbors in Carrick and Annandale as harrying the English. To support them was in no way to preserve the amity of the guardians. John Comyn, who had already evinced his hot temper at the meeting in Selkirk Forest, responded to these arguments by declaring vehemently that he would no longer serve with the Bishop of St. Andrews. The Earl of Athol and James Stewart, both supporters of Bruce, intervened on behalf of the bishop, but in the end it was Bruce who resigned, and his place was taken by Sir Ingram de Umfraville, a kinsman of Belial's and an ally of the Comyns. Bruce's resignation may have been partly in the interest of harmony, but more surely because he felt that if the Comyns were going to meddle in Galloway, his presence was needed in Carrick to preserve his family interest in the southwest, and it is there that for the next 2 years he confined his activities. The remaining magnates, apart from the Earl of Butchar, who in fact went to Galloway to try to enlist the support of the leading men against the English, held a parliament in Rutherglen on the 10th of May to prepare for a summer campaign. Events overtook them. King Edward's further writs for a feudal levy had been obeyed. On Midsummer's Day 1300, he held a court at Carlisle, accompanied by his young queen, Margarete, sister of the King of France, whom he had married the previous year, and there reviewed the assembled troops. So great was their number, according to a contemporary ballad, that the hills and valleys resounded to the neighing of horses, and the ground was carpeted with tents, wagons, and all the accoutrements of war. The chivalry of England, in its splendor, was marshalled in 4 great squadrons, an auxiliary force placed under the command of Anthony Beck, Bishop of Durham, ever at hand when there was fighting. So with an army comparable to that which he had commanded at Falkirk, King Edward crossed the Solway Firth into Scotland, while a fleet of 58 ships guarded his flank, and kept watch on the coast of Galloway. The conquest of the southwest seemed imminent. But the outcome was a dismal anticlimax. After capturing the castle of Carlavorroch and its handful of defenders, this menacing force achieved nothing. King Edward marched them along the coastal plain as far as Wigton, hampered by appalling weather, and then retraced his steps. At Kirkcudbright, on his outward progress, shadowed by the Scottish guardians in the rugged hills to the north, the king was waited on by the Earl of Buchan and John Comyn with Scottish proposals of peace, the restoration of John Belial to the throne, and the return to the Scottish magnates of their forfeited English estates. He regarded these terms as impertinent and dismissed them with contempt. Stung into rashness by Edward's response, Buchan, Comyn, and Umfraville descended from the sheltering hills and attempted to oppose his crossing of the River Cree, but, after the first charge of his armored knights, fled in disorder into the boggy moors to their rear, where heavy cavalry could not pursue them, leaving Sir Robert Keith, Mareschal of Scotland, prisoner in his hands. By the end of August, King Edward was back in Sweetheart Abbey, hard by Carlavarock, angry and frustrated. If his parade of power was meant to draw adherents to his cause, it had failed entirely. His barons refused to continue their feudal service beyond the prescribed 2 months. His foot soldiers, drawn mainly from the northern shires, were deserting in their hundreds. It was at this unpropitious moment that the Archbishop of Canterbury reached him after a long and arduous journey and, at the king's request, read aloud before the assembled court a papal bull, indicted more than a year ago, which he had brought with him, and this Pope Boniface VIII, after detailing in lucid phrases the devious means by which King Edward had imposed upon the trusting Scots, ordered him to desist from inflicting injuries on that unhappy people, and withdraw from a country which, as thou knowest, my son, is and was a fief of the Holy See. The Archbishop followed this recitation by an address imploring the king, for the love of Mount Zion and Jerusalem, to yield to the Pope's decree. "By God's blood," the king exploded, "I will not keep my peace for Mount Zion nor silence for Jerusalem. By while there is breath in my nostrils, I will defend my right, which all the world knows, with all my power." The shaken archbishop was ushered from his presence, and later informed that the king would consult his barons, and then replied to the Pope. The papal broadside was the culmination of Scottish diplomacy at the Vatican. Pope Boniface VIII, elected supreme pontiff in 1294, after a series of ineffective predecessors, was a determined and ambitious prelate. He believed that all the princes on earth owed sovereignty to the Vicar of Christ, and that the Church of Rome, as it were the United Nations, should be the acknowledged arbiter of international disputes. His conversion to the cause of Scottish independence had been inspired, as early as the summer of 1298, by the arguments of William Lamberton, who had been in Rome, awaiting his consecration as Bishop of St. Andrews, which took place on the 1st of June of that year. It had been confirmed by the passionate pleadings of David Moray, uncle of Andrew Moray, the young hero of Stirling Bridge. David Moray had been appointed Bishop of Moray by Robert Bruce and John Comyn when they were joint guardians, and had followed his compatriot Lamberton to the Holy See for the laying on of hands. The public opposition of the Pope compounded the problems facing King Edward. His barons stubbornly refused military service until he reformed the forest charters, and the French king constantly postponed the translation of the truce between them into a formal peace treaty. In these circumstances, King Edward recognized the need for a breathing space for maneuver. On the 30th of October 1300, at the instance of King Philip of France, he agreed a truce between England and Scotland to last until the 21st of May 1301, and, as a mollifying gesture to the Pope, released from prison Robert Wishart, the Bishop of Glasgow. But no sooner had he settled his differences with his barons, and rallied them behind him in his rejection of the papal bull than he set in train measures for yet another invasion of Scotland, his 6th campaign, to take place in the summer of 1301. His intention was once again to deal with the Scottish stronghold in the southwest. Robert Bruce, since his relinquishment of the guardianship, had been building up his forces in Carrick, and had made himself master of Turnberry Castle. It is probable that during that period he had visited the Bruce possessions in Northern Ireland, in Northern Ireland and the northeast highlands of Scotland as reservoirs of reinforcements. He kept his distance from the communes, and his only link with them would appear to have been through William Lamberton, Bishop of St. Andrews, who was desperately trying to prevent a complete breach between the two families. It was with this aim, one must assume, that early in 1301, the bishop retired from the guardianship and persuaded John Comyn and his supporter Sir Ingram de Umfraville to do likewise in favor of Sir John Soulis as sole guardian. Sir John was connected by marriage with the Comyns, but was also a close neighbor of the Bruces, and could thus act as a stabilizing factor between the two. Sir John had now to deal with the two-pronged invasion which King Edward launched in July 1301. His son, the Prince of Wales, was to drive up the coast of Galloway and Ayrshire from Carlisle, supported by ships in the Firth of Clyde, to inhibit any aid from Ireland and so, in his father's words, to gain the chief honour of taming the pride of the Scots, while the king himself from Berwick would secure the defensive line of the Forth in Clyde, cut the link between the unsubdued Highlands and the southwest, and then, joining forces with his son, isolate and crush the latter area. The grandiose design was unfulfilled. Sir John Soulis, with his forces, operated between the two English armies, harrying the flanks of both without ever committing himself to a frontal attack, while Robert Bruce, after holding out in Turnberry Castle until September, withdrew his men, immobilized the troops who had captured the castle, and forced the Prince of Wales by constant forays to retreat to Carlisle. The prince then moved east to join his father at Linlithgow, to which the king had retired after his one success, the seizure of Bothwell Castle, on the direct route between the Highlands and the southwest. The pincer prongs had never met. During the winter, while King Edward remained at Linlithgow, engaged in building a castle and organizing the shipment of horses, fodder, and supplies from England, the King of France negotiated with him a truce on behalf of the Scots, to run from the 26th of January 1302 to the end of November. Effectively, this meant a lull in hostilities until campaigning weather in the late spring of 1303. At the court of France, King Philip felt a growing ascendancy over the English monarch. Twice in 2 years, King Edward had failed in his Scottish campaigns. Twice in 2 years he had been forced to accept the French demands for a truce with the Scots, which previously he had utterly rejected. His arguments at the Vatican court against the papal bull had been brilliantly demolished by the Scottish envoy, Master Meldred Besset. Judgment had been given in favor of the Scots, and in the summer of 1301, their abdicated king, John Baliol, had been released from the jurisdiction of the Pope, to whom King Edward had handed him over in July 1299, to dwell as a free man in the Kingdom of France. In Scotland, the significance of this move had not been lost. Writs which before that time had been issued by successive guardians as on behalf of King John, were now issued as by King John, to be valid at our will, or that of our dearest son Edward, or of John de Soulis, guardian of our kingdom. And a new seal was struck with the name and title of King John on the observe, and the name and arms of John de Soulis, knight, only on the reverse. A strong rumour swept through the Scottish kingdom that the King of France was to restore John Baliol to his throne at the head of a powerful French army. No news could be more unpalatable to Robert Bruce. For years he had fought for the independence of Scotland, sacrificing his personal standing and inheritance in England. In Scotland, his lands in the southwest, during the last 2 years, had been the main object of English attacks and had been ravaged and burned by the invader, while those of the communes north of the Forth had been untouched by war. Yet increasingly he had been cold-shouldered by the communes, and cut off from the inner councils of state. If John Baliol was restored to the throne, John Comyn, the Red, of Badenoch, would in effect become the ruler of the realm, and there was no man more jealous of Bruce or more given to outbursts of temper. In 1295, John Baliol had handed over to his relation, John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, the Bruce patrimony of Annandale, if he returned in triumph with a French army at his back. All the Bruce inheritance in Scotland, Annandale, Carrick and Garrock, would be at risk. King Edward was no less apprehensive of the rumored threat. On the spiritual and secular plane, he had never been so weak. His designs on Scotland still aroused the grave displeasure of the Pope, and the sword of excommunication was rattling in its sheath. The King of France was at peace with all his European neighbors. He had annexed Flanders and had Gascony firmly under control. Now at last he had a secure base from which he could afford to divert his military forces to the support of the Scots. This threat to both Bruce and King Edward forced an understanding between the two. The truce arranged in January 1302 gave an opportunity for negotiations to be opened, and on the 16th of February 1302, Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, made his submission to the English king on the following terms. Be it remembered that Robert Bruce the Younger, who was in homage and faith the King of England for the earldom of Carrick, rose in rebellion against the said king his lord, through evil counsel, and has submitted himself to the peace and will of the same king. In hope of his good grace, the king, for the sake of the good service which Robert's ancestors and family have rendered to the king and his ancestors, and the good service which Robert himself has promised to render in the future, has declared his grace and will in this manner. That is to say that Robert and his men and his tenants of Carrick will be guaranteed life and limb, lands and tenements, and will be free from imprisonment. If it should happen that papal ordinance, or by a truce or by a conditional peace touching the war against Scotland, or the war against France, the aforesaid Robert should be at a disadvantage, so that he may not be able to enjoy his own lands, of which he has possession at present in Scotland. The king promises to take his loss into consideration, so that he may have reasonable maintenance, as is proper for him. And the king grants to Robert that, so far as it lies in his power, he will not be disinherited of any land which may fall to him by right from his father, in England or in Scotland. And the king grants to Robert the wardship and marriage of the Earl of Mar's son and heir, and because it is feared that the kingdom of Scotland may be removed out of the king's hands, which God forbid, and handed over to Sir John Baliol, or to his son, or that the right may be brought into dispute, or reversed, or appealed in a fresh judgment, the king grants to Robert that he may pursue his right, and the king will hear him fairly, and hold him to justice in the king's court, if, by any chance, it should happen that the right must be adjudicated elsewhere than in the king's court. Then in this case, the king promises Robert assistance and counsel as before, as well as he is able to give it. And if, after the kingdom is at peace in the king's hands, any person should wish to do injury to Robert, the king will maintain and defend him in his right, as a lord ought to do for his man. And in witness of all these points, the king has ordered these letters patent to be made and sealed with his privy seal. The admission by King Edward of John Baliol's possible restoration underlines how real that danger appeared, and the difficult dilemma in which Robert Bruce was placed. He was estranged from his father, who had retired to his English estates, but he had many of his brothers and sisters to consider, and a new influence had entered into his life. He had fallen in love with Elizabeth de Burgh, daughter of the Earl of Ulster, one of King Edward's staunchest lieutenants. How or when they met is not recorded, but it could have been in early days at the English court, or in Northern Ireland, where the lands of the two families were adjacent, or at the house of James Stuart, whose wife, Aegidia de Burgh, was Elizabeth's aunt. As soon as Robert Bruce had made his peace with the English king, thus ensuring that he would not become landless, his marriage to Elizabeth took place. Bruce's second marriage was to last through stress and tribulation, separation and reunion until his wife's death 25 years later. The submission of Bruce eliminated one of the bastions of Scottish independence. King Edward, as an experienced strategist, had long recognized that he could not carry out operations north of the Forth, so long as the army of Carrick, under a brilliant young commander, could threaten his communications from the rugged hills of the southwest. In 2 successive campaigns, he had sought to destroy it, but what he could not achieve by force had been brought about by politics, and his fertile mind began to contemplate measures to bring to subjection the unsubdued areas of Scotland, which it had hitherto been unsafe to attempt. In January 1303, he obtained the consent of Parliament to exact by various means funds to finance the raising of a new and mighty army, which he ordered to assemble in May. In February he dispatched Sir John Seagrave, his viceroy in Scotland, and Ralph Mountain, his cofferer, to make a reconnaissance in strength towards Stirling, with 3 brigades of armed knights, and report back on the condition of the country, and the whereabouts and strength of the Scottish forces. By the evening of the 23rd of February, the 3 columns had reached the neighbourhood of Roslin, south of Edinburgh, and owing to the nature of the ground had each pitched their tents at some distance from each other. News of their advance had reached John Comyn, the Red, and Simon Fraser, who were hidden with their men in the thickets of Selkirk Forest. With a picked force of mounted troops, they rode through the night, and as dawn broke, fell upon the unsuspecting detachment commanded by Sir John Seagrave. Ralph Mountain was slain, and Sir John Seagrave severely wounded and made captive, but a fugitive from the onset alerted Robert de Ville, who was quietly hearing mass some miles away. Calling to arms his knights, Sir Robert galloped to the fray, and after a sharp struggle, rescued Sir John Seagrave, and drove off the Scots from the plunder on which they had been engaged. The Scots made much of the encounter and spread it abroad as a major victory. It was the last triumph they could claim. Events on the continent had undergone a startling revolution. Boniface VIII and Philip of France had quarrelled, and the very Pope who had thundered against the pretensions of King Edward in Scotland was now wooing his support and admonishing the Scottish bishops to show to their overlord the obedience and respect which was his due. In Flanders, the Flemings had risen in revolt and slain the French garrisons in their towns, and at Courtrai, on the 11th of July 1302, the flower of French chivalry, arrogant and contemptuous of their pedestrian foes, had hurled themselves to death in their hundreds against the massed spears of the citizens of Bruges and Ghent. In December of the same year, the burghers of Bordeaux, inspired by the Flemish example, expelled the French from their city. In the space of a few months, King Philip's commanding position had been seriously undermined. His feudal host had been decimated. His conquered territories were in revolt. He was embroiled with the Pope and threatened with excommunication in the bitter struggle with the Supreme Pontiff, which was to end in the capture and death of Boniface VIII and the move of puppet popes to Avignon. He needed concentration of his resources. After rejecting year after year the overtures from King Edward for a definitive peace, he now offered to return whatever territory in Aquitaine had been surrendered by the English. King Edward responded with alacrity, and in exchange for this restitution, sealed on the 30th of May 1303 a treaty of offensive and defensive alliance. And on the same day the Prince of Wales, by proxy, plighted his troth to Isabel, the King of France's daughter. In vain, a powerful delegation of Scottish nobles, including John Soulis, Bishop Lamberton, the Earl of Buchan, James Stewart, Ingram de Umfraville, and William Belial, had sailed to Paris to keep the French king staunch to his Scottish alliance. His main objective demanded their sacrifice. Their country was excluded from the treaty, and they were left to face alone the full onslaught that King Edward had already planned for their subjection. Never had his preparations for a campaign been more thorough and elaborate. The latest siege engines were transported to Scotland by sea. 3 huge prefabricated bridges were towed to the Firth of Forth, so that the English army could bypass Stirling Castle and cross directly into Fife. The Prince of Wales and the Earl of Ulster commanded an army in the west, and the king himself in the east. In the event, it was a military parade, leaving Roxburgh in May 1303. King Edward marched up the eastern route, as in 1296 to reach Kinloss Abbey near Elgin in September without meeting any serious resistance. Only at Brecon Castle was his progress halted. There, with superb defiance, Sir Thomas Maule held him at bay until on the 9th of August he was killed on the battlements and the garrison capitulated. The king remained at Kinloss Abbey for long enough to strengthen his hold on turbulent Moray and receive submissions, and then retraced his steps to Dunfermline Abbey for winter quarters from October to February 1304. There the history of 1296 repeated itself. Men and communities flocked to submit. John Comyn the Red, who had taken over the guardianship when John Soulis sailed to France, was still at large with a fighting force in Selkirk Forest. But on the 9th of February at Strathhord near Perth, he came to terms with the king. The settlement he negotiated on behalf of the community of the realm was very different from the abject surrender of John Belial, and reflected a new approach by King Edward. In the conditions it was laid down that the Scottish people should be protected in all their laws, usages, customs, and liberties in every particular as they existed in the time of Alexander III, unless there are laws to be amended, in which case it should be done with the advice of King Edward, and the advice and consent of the responsible men of the land. There should be no disinheritance of the Scottish leaders, and forfeited estates could be redeemed by their owners on the payment of varying fines. For some there should be short periods of exile, but all in all, it was a generous settlement, and it is not unreasonable to believe that it was the advice of Robert Bruce which in part persuaded the king that only by a magnanimous gesture could be hoped to confirm a peace. The magnanimity of the monarch was diminished by two vindictive actions. Sir William Oliphant, who held Stirling Castle in the name of King John, by order of Sir John Soulis, asked permission to send a messenger to his master to find out whether he might surrender it, or whether he should defend it to the last. King Edward refused this reasonable request for no other cause than his determination to test in action the great siege engines he had transported from England. So, for 3 months from May to July 1304, Oliphant and his men, loyal to their commission, were subjected to the battering of every ingenious invention in King Edward's engineers, the vicar, the parson, the Gloucester, the belfry, a baker's dozen of engines in all, pounded the castle walls while the English queen and her ladies amused their idle hours by watching the proceedings from a balcony in Stirling town. Even when the garrison finally offered to surrender unconditionally, King Edward delayed his reply until his latest and greatest machine, the Warwolf, had had time to reach him and be tried out in a massive bombardment against the now suppliant defenders. But even more malignant was his treatment of William Wallace. He had never forgotten nor forgiven that it was this man alone who, in all the successive campaigns against Scotland, had inflicted the one decisive defeat upon the English. In his negotiations with John Comyn, the terms for the Scottish surrender contained these baleful words: "No words of peace are to be held out to William Wallace in any circumstances in our will. The Steward, Sir John de Soulis, and Sir Ingram de Umfraville are not to have safe conduct, nor come within the king's power until Sir William Wallace is given up. Sir John Comyn, Sir Alexander Lindsay, Sir David Graham, and Sir Simon Fraser shall exert themselves until 20 days after Christmas to capture Sir William Wallace, and hand him over to the king, who will watch to see how each of them conducts himself, so that he can do most favor to whoever shall capture Wallace, with regard to exile or legal claims or expiation of past misdeeds." For 7 years little had been heard of Wallace, except a fleeting reference to his presence in Paris and in Rome. Now, at the very time when the Scottish nobles were bending their knee to the conqueror, he emerged from the shadow, still defiant, to clash with the English near Peebles in February 1304, and again at the bridge of Erne in September 1304. Then there is silence again, until the fateful day of the 3rd of August 1305, when he is betrayed and captured in Glasgow in the house of Robert Ray, a servant of Sir John Menteith. For 400 miles along the dusty summer roads, he was led on horseback to London, with his legs tied beneath the belly of his beast. On his arrival in the evening of the 2nd of August, he was lodged for the night in the house of Alderman William de Lyry in the parish of All Hallows Fenchurch, and from there next morning he was taken in procession by the mayor of London, the aldermen, and the sheriffs, through the thronged streets and jeering crowds to Westminster Hall. There, with his huge frame bound and shackled, he was seated at the south end of the hall to face his judges. A coronet of laurel leaves was mockingly placed upon his brow, because of his alleged boast that one day he would be crowned at Westminster. He was not allowed to plead or make defense, but in silence listening to a long indictment of all his crimes against the English, culminating in the charge of treason, and that he had been unmindful of his troth and allegiance. Only then he spoke. He admitted all his acts against the English which he had done in defense of his country against her enemy. But he denied that he had ever been a traitor to the King of England, for never had he pledged to him his allegiance. Nevertheless, it was of treason that the court found him guilty, and it was for that offense that the king had devised an appalling penalty. It was inflicted on Wallace the same day. He was chained flat to a hurdle, and for the greater entertainment of the populace, was dragged by horses along a circuitous route over 4 miles of cobblestones from Westminster to Smithfield. There he was hanged, but cut down, half strangled, and still alive. Then he was castrated and disemboweled. His genitals and entrails were burned before his eyes, and, after his unspeakable agony had been ended by the headman's axe, his heart was ripped out and added to the flames. His body was then hacked into 4 pieces. His head was mounted on a pike on London Bridge, and the 4 quarters were distributed to Newcastle on Tyne, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth to be displayed to the public's eye as menacing symbols of King Edward's might. But the flesh had hardly shredded from his dismembered bones than he had become a legend among the common folk of Scotland. A sense of injustice rankled in their minds. The great nobles had vowed and disavowed their allegiance to an alien monarch, and yet had retained their territories and their lives. But a landless man of lesser rank, who had never broken his oath because he had never done homage, was condemned to degradation and a vile death simply for doing his duty in defense of his country. King Edward thought to make an example. He made a martyr instead. The name of William Wallace has echoed down the centuries as a trumpet call to Scotsmen in whatever corner of the globe they dwell. Chapter 7. By this one act King Edward unraveled forever the web of cooperation he had sought to create by the conciliatory settlement of 1304 and his subsequent measures. In the spring of 1305, he had appointed Robert Bruce, the Bishop of Glasgow, and Sir John Mowbray to drop a report on the future settlement of Scotland. Their recommendation was that the community of the realm should be summoned to elect 10 persons to attend the next English Parliament to help draw up a new constitution for their kingdom. On receiving the king's acceptance, they convened a Scottish Parliament. On receiving the king's acceptance, they convened a Scottish Parliament on Perth in May, at which the 10 were duly chosen, representing the earls, the bishops, the barons, the abbots, and the lay community. The elected members attended the Westminster Parliament in September 1305, and in company with 20 English colleagues, drew up an ordinance for the government of the land, no longer the realm of Scotland. On the surface this appeared to give a form of self-government to the Scots. The viceroy, it is true, was to be the king's nephew, the Earl of Richmond, and the Chancellor and the Chamberlain were to be English, but they were to be advised and assisted by a Scottish council of 22 members, consisting of 4 bishops, 4 abbots, 5 earls, and 9 barons, among whom were 3 former guardians, Robert Bruce, Bishop Lamberton, and John Comyn the Red. In spite of the number and eminence of these advisory councillors, and the fact that, apart from the southeast counties, most of the sheriffdoms in the country were to be held by Scotsmen, the ultimate power was nevertheless concentrated in the hands of the viceroy, who had the authority vested in him to dismiss and replace officials on his own initiative, and to maintain in such strategic castles as he thought fit English garrisons and English governors. However, King Edward believed that the Iron Fist was sufficiently covered by the Velvet Glove for the Scots, tamed by their many defeats, to acquiesce in the new arrangements and combine peacefully to put them into operation. So confident was he that, pending the arrival of the new viceroy, he appointed a committee of 4 to administer the country in his stead, headed by no other than William Lamberton, Bishop of St. Andrews. It was an ironic choice, for the bishop was already organizing in secret a combination for the recovery of Scottish independence. For 8 years, the Scottish Church had been the coordinating factor behind the Scottish resistance, and Bishop Lamberton had been the architect of that coordination. He had supported the Comyns. He had used his powerful influence to reconcile the factions of Bruce and Comyn, but his instruments had broken in his hand. When he had returned from France after the settlement of 1304 and paid his homage to King Edward, he thought deeply on what potentialities for freedom remained. During his sojourn into Paris, he had realized that, while the French were lavish in their promises, they were too exercised by their own problems to give an active help to Scotland, and that their protege, the abdicated king, John Baliol, had neither the ambition nor the wish to forsake his sequestered rural existence for the hurly-burly of dynastic struggle. Yet in that hierarchical age, only a king could inspire and synthesize the deep-felt desires of prelate, knight, and common man. Wallace had not had the qualifications. The Comyn figurehead was discredited. Only one man remained who had a justifiable claim to the throne, and the personality, ambition, skill, prowess, and magnetism to achieve that end: Robert Bruce. Between his surrender to King Edward in 1302 and the fall of Stirling Castle, Robert Bruce had maintained a cautious and diplomatic stance, giving lip service to the English monarch, but quietly rendering nugatory any demands for his military support. As early as the 11th of March 1302, he had written to the monks of Melrose Abbey: "Whereas I have often vexed the Abbey's tenants on the Grange of Maybole, by leading them all over the country in my army of Carrick, although there was no summons of the common army of the realm, troubled in conscience, I shall never again demand such an army's service, neither of many nor of few, unless the common army of the whole realm is raised for its defence, when all inhabitants are bound to serve." As a Scottish historian pertinently remarks, Bruce's conscience did not trouble him until the beginning of Lent 1302, just in time to ensure that his army would be of less use to Edward than it had been to the Scots. Again, when asked by King Edward in the spring of 1304 to forward the English siege engines for the attack on Stirling Castle, he duly complied, but omitted to include the vital part of the machinery necessary for their function. And yet again, when called upon to supply troops for the same purpose, he wrote personally to the king on 4th of April 1304 that he has been in London in Essex, where his lands lie, and is still there endeavouring in every possible way to procure horses and armour for himself and his people, but he had no success whatever in his attempts to borrow for the purpose or get a penny of his rents. During King Edward's invasion of Scotland in 1303, he had been with the Prince of Wales and his father-in-law, the Earl of Ulster, on the western route, which was no more than an unopposed military parade, and was left in charge of Ayr Castle. From there he was ordered to join Sir John Seagrave in February 1304 to make a mounted raid on Wallace and Simon Fraser in Selkirk Forest. But it is significant that while some of their followers were captured, both these leaders had prior warning and escaped, for which Bruce was gently chided by King Edward with the words, "As the cloak is well made, also make the hood." It was a difficult and uneasy role to play, but until the autumn of 1305, it succeeded. Not only he, but members of his family obtained the favors and dangerous friendship of the monarch. Edward Bruce, his brother next in age, was placed in the Prince of Wales' household, and a younger brother, Alexander, after a brilliant career at Cambridge University. "No one," wrote a contemporary, "who reads art at Cambridge before or since his time ever made such progress," was granted by royal favor the living of Kirkconnel near Wigtown, and made Dean of Glasgow. Bruce himself had already been given the guardianship of his younger nephew, Earl Donald of Mar, with all the benefits of the great Mar estates in the northeast and the control of the formidable stone-built fortress of Kildrummie, as well as the wardenship of 3 royal forests. In March 1305, he asked for and obtained the de Umfraville land in Carrick, and in the same month was entrusted in company with Bishop Wishart and Sir John Mowbray to ordain in what manner the guardians of Scotland should organize its defense. He was indeed a favorite son. And it is understandable that he should be so. Long ago, when Prince of Wales, Edward had assessed the fine temper of the family, when Bruce's grandfather and father had been his companions in arms in the heat and dust of the Holy Land. Now, when the descendant, he saw all those qualities that he most admired: sagacity, endurance, courage, and skill in arms. So, in his relationship with Bruce, there was something deeper than a politic wooing of a powerful Scottish magnate. And on Bruce's side, too, there must have been a respect for the determination and abilities of the older man, for in his future kingship he was to model much upon the royal pattern he had observed. So, when his father died in March 1304, and at the age of 30, Bruce succeeded to the vast family estates in the counties of Essex and Huntingdon, Dumfries and Aberdeen. There was every worldly reason why he should pursue the path of conformity and enjoy the pleasure of married life and the courtly circles of the crown. But the Celtic blood of his mother pulled him towards Scotland. The community of the realm, that conception to which every Scottish document had referred during the years of struggle, had become to him over the past decade a living entity, and overriding all affinity to the English king was the profound conviction that he and he alone was the rightful monarch of the northern realm, whose mission it must be, when the time was ripe, to recover its ancient independence. After obtaining probity of his English estates in May 1304, he travelled north to King Edward's camp outside Stirling Castle at the same time as Bishop Lamberton reached it from France. There King Edward was indulging an old man's vanity by showing off his virile prowess before his young queen. Mounted on horseback, he rode so close beneath the walls of the besieged castle in order to direct operations that on one occasion a javelin hurled from the ramparts lodged in the steel plates of his armor, and on another a huge stone fell so near that his horse reared and overturned with its master, who was lifted up, dazed and shaken, and carried by soldiers to his tent. When the old friends prelate and earl observed or heard of these proceedings, the same thought must have come to them both. The king was an old man who, by the hazard of war or by sickness, must soon die, and when he was succeeded by the Prince of Wales, of whose vacillating character they were both aware, a new opportunity for Scotland's freedom could arise. On the 11th of June 1304, at the Abbey of Cambus Kenneth they signed a bond that they should mutually help each other in all their several businesses and affairs at all times, and against all other persons whatever without any deceit, and that neither of them should undertake any important business without the other of them. They will mutually warn each other against any impending danger, and do the best to avert the same from each other, and for the full performance of the agreement they bound themselves by oath and under the penalty of the sum of £10,000 to be applied for the recovery of the Holy Land. No more was written, but there can be little doubt that from that time plans were quietly being prepared through the network of the Church for a decisive action in the event of King Edward's death. One major problem that had to be solved was the attitude of John Comyn the Red. For nearly 7 years he had been in the forefront of opposition to the English, but, brave and pugnacious as he was, his efforts had been amateur and ineffective, and at the end had left the kingdom as much a conquered province as she had been in 1296. Nevertheless, even if he had lost the confidence of the Church, he was still the head of one of the most powerful families in Scotland, and either his full support of his elimination was essential to the success of any revolt. In the late summer of 1305, while the 10 Scottish commissioners were making their way to London to attend the September Parliament and draw up an ordinance for their country, Robert Bruce and Bishop Wishart, who had deliberately excluded themselves from that body, remained in Scotland. It is reasonable to surmise that during that period parleys with John Comyn began. News in October that King Edward lay sick in bed gave urgency to the proceedings, and Bruce offered Comyn a simple choice. Help me to be king, and I will give you my estates, or give me your estates, and I will help you. John Comyn preferred possessions to the crown, and an exchange of signed and sealed documents was made between them to that effect. It is possible that John Comyn would have adhered to his commitments if King Edward had not recovered from his sickness, but unfortunately for all, the monarch regained his health with a mind already burgeoning with suspicion. Correspondence with certain Scottish nobles had been found on William Wallace when he was seized. Nothing is known of its content, but almost immediately the smiling face of the king towards Robert Bruce began to darken. On the 15th of September 1305, he gave orders. Let it be commanded to the Earl of Carrick that he place Kildrummy Castle in the keeping of a man for whom he shall answer. And on the 10th of October, he revoked the gift of D. Umfraville's lands to Bruce that he had made 6 months before, and returned them to their owner. Both Kildrummy Castle and the D. Umfraville lands were in sensitive areas where resistance to his rule was most likely to erupt. Kildrummy was the key to Moray, in whose mountains the Bishop of Moray still lurked, outside the king's peace, with a body of turbulent followers, and men everywhere in Carrick had a close association with Bruce through his mother's side. King Edward smelled mischief, but he was too shrewd a ruler to show his hand until he could discover how far the ramifications of conspiracy extended. If conspiracy there was. Robert Bruce and John Comyn still remained on the Advisory Council for Scotland, and during the winter of 1305-6, Bruce must have visited his English estates, for he was at the English court in January 1306. Whether because he lost his nerve as the king's spies went to work, or out of jealousy of his coeval, or in the hope of material reward, John Comyn informed King Edward of the covenant into which he had entered, and told him that he would produce as proof the document signed and sealed by Bruce. King Edward kept his own counsel, and, while he was awaiting delivery of documentary proof, assumed again his friendliness to Bruce. But one evening, while he was entertaining an inner circle of his friends, and the wine was circulating freely, he grew expansive, and let fall that on the morrow he had in mind to arrest the Earl of Carrick, and try him for treason. Among his guests was the Earl of Gloucester, whose family had, for generations, been linked in friendship with the Bruces. Hastily he sent the keeper of his wardrobe to Bruce's lodging, with 12 pence and a pair of spurs, which the keeper presented to Bruce with the words, "My lord sends these to you in return for what he, on his side, got from you yesterday." Bruce may have sensed a duplicity in the king, and arranged with his friend to give this signal if danger was imminent, or he was quick to take an unpremeditated hint. He handed back the 12 pence, with thanks to the keeper, and sent his squire secretly to saddle 2 horses. Then he told his staff not to disturb him, as he had much work to do in this chamber, and quietly slipped out to join his squire, and ride through the night toward his castle at Lochmaben, where his wife and brothers were in residence. By day and night the two rode northward, and as they neared the border they met a Scotsman traveling south, a rare sight at that time of the year. Bruce stopped to ask to do what destination he was bound, and something uneasy in the man's behavior aroused his suspicions. So he had him searched, and on his person was found a letter from John Comyn to King Edward, enclosing the bond which Bruce had signed and sealed. Having disposed of this ill-fated man, Bruce reached Lochmaben on the 5th day after his departure from London, and told his brothers of all that had occurred. At that time, King Edward's justices were holding their sessions in the nearby town of Dumfries, to which the local magnates would normally repair. John Comyn was at his castle of Dalsminton 9 miles away, so Bruce sent him a message requesting that they should meet on the 10th of February at Grey Friars Church on their way to the sessions. When he appeared, the two withdrew for privacy to the high altar, and there Bruce drew forth the bond and taxed John Comyn with his treachery. Angry words ensued and daggers were drawn, but Bruce got his blow in first, and Comyn fell wounded on the altar steps. His uncle, Sir Robert Comyn, who was nearby, sprang forward and struck Bruce on the breast with his sword, but his blade was deflected by Bruce's armor, and he in turn was cut to the ground by Christopher Seton, the husband of Bruce's sister Christina. In haste, the two men left the church to join the followers of Bruce, who were waiting outside. Calling for his horse, Bruce was about to mount, when one of them, Roger Kirkpatrick, seeing his commander's agitation and the blood upon his clothes, asked what had occurred. "I doubt," said Bruce, "that I have slain Red Comyn." "Do you doubt?" replied Kirkpatrick. "Then I'll make sure." And followed by James Lindsay, he ran to the church and dispatched the wounded man. The bloody deed was done, and Bruce had now to risk his all or run for shelter to his sister's court in Norway. His choice was instant. Hailing his men-at-arms, he rode so fast to Dumfries Castle that the garrison, taken by surprise, surrendered quickly, and their constable, Sir Richard Seward, was made captive. The startled justices, who were holding their sessions in the great hall, barricaded the doors, but given by Bruce the choice of having the castle burned about them or a free passage to England, they preferred to preserve their lives. As word spread of Bruce's success, the Scots began to flock to his banner, but the odds against him were enormous. The plans on which he and the church had been working were based on the premise of King Edward's death. Now they had been precipitated by the murder of Comyn, and their chances of success were immeasurably diminished. The formidable monarch was still alive and in command of superior forces. The powerful relatives of the dead Comyn were roused to savage vengeance against his assassin, and the bloodstains on the altar steps filled with a superstitious terror the simple minds of the common people. All depended upon the reaction of the Scottish Church. But the Scottish Church was staunch to the single principle which had animated its actions during the years of strife: the independence of Scotland. When Bruce hurried from Dumfries to Bishop Wishart's in Glasgow, and kneeling before him made confession of his violence, the little bishop shrived him of all his sins and gave him absolution for the sacrilege he had committed. The clergy throughout the country were so informed, and adjured in the name of their bishops to rally to Bruce as to a sacred cause. Bruce in return swore a solemn oath to preserve and defend the liberties of the Scottish Church. Uplifted and strengthened by this spiritual help, Bruce acted with rapidity and strategic skill. The castles of Denaverty, Rothesay, and Ayr, which commanded the Firth of Clyde and could keep open the way for reinforcements and supplies from Ireland and the Outer Isles, were occupied by his supporters through force or by agreement, and those of Tibbers and Dulswinton were seized, and, with the castles of Dumfries and Lochmaben already in hand, effectively dominated the western route to Scotland. Orders were issued placing all persons on 24 hours' notice of mobilization, and a formal demand was sent to King Edward that he should recognize Robert Bruce as King of Scots. The response, not unexpectedly, was that Bruce should return to the English crown all the castles he had seized, to which in return he replied that he would continue to capture castles until his demand was met, and would defend himself with the longest stick he had. Mindful of his bond with Bishop Lamberton, Bruce had conveyed to him a message that he was to have himself crowned at Scone on the 25th of March 1306, 10 years to a day since the outbreak of war between English and Scots. Lamberton was then at Berwick in his capacity as President of the Council, acting on behalf of the absent English Viceroy of Scotland, to which he had been entrusted by King Edward. Under cover of darkness, when the opportunity came, he slipped away and hastened to Scone to be present at the ceremony. As harbinger of his coming, he had sent secretly to Bruce his young squire, James Douglas. Some time after the boy's father, the irascible Sir William Douglas, had died in the Tower of London, and his lands had been given to Lord Clifford by King Edward. The bishop had taken James into his household, now, as Barbour writes, all alone. He took the road to Lochmaben, and near Arrochstone he met the Bruce riding with a great company to Scone to be enthroned and made king. And when Douglas saw him coming, he rode forward in haste and greeted him, and made obeisance very courteously, and told him all his conditions, and who he was, and how Clifford held his inheritance. Also that he came to do homage to him as his rightful king, and was ready in everything to share his fortune. And when Bruce had heard his desire, he received him with much pleasure, and gave him men and arms, for he judged that he would be worthy of his fathers, who were brave and able men. Thus they made their acquaintance, that never afterwards by any chance of any kind was broken while they lived. Their friendship increased ever more and more, for Douglas served always loyally, and Bruce so wise, strong, and valiant gladly, and well rewarded his service. On the 25th of March, 1306, in the Abbey of Scone, Robert Bruce was crowned King of Scots with all the formality and solemnity that could be achieved. The kingly robes and vestments which Bishop Wishart had hidden in his treasury against this longed-for day were brought out by the old man and set upon King Robert, and a circlet of gold was placed upon his head, while the great banner of the kings of Scotland, with its lion and scarlet lilies, that had lain so long concealed, was planted behind his throne. 3 bishops of Glasgow, St. Andrews, and Moray were there, and 4 earls of Athol, Lennox, Menteith, and Mar. But noticeably absent was the Earl of Fife. He was still a youth and held in England as a ward of court, and thus unable to perform his hereditary office in the ceremony. But his 19-year-old sister, Isabel, who was married to the Earl of Buchan, now an ally of King Edward and close kinsman of the dead Comyn, got knowledge of the coronation. To her the call of Scotland and her youthful hero worship of Bruce proved greater than her wifely duty. Seizing her husband's finest horses, she rode with utmost speed to Scone to act on her brother's behalf. She arrived a day too late, but so that the rites of ancient tradition might be served, a second ceremony was performed. On Palm Sunday, 48 hours after the first, in which the golden circlet was lifted in her youthful hands, and once more placed upon the brow of Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, Lord of Annandale, King of Scots.